Hello and welcome everyone to an edition of what would normally be the Sunday show, but it's Saturday, so that's not what it is. We're talking about the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict of 2022. Joining me from Iowa is Dr. Jonathon Dreeze. You'll remember him from the previous videos on the Stalin Super Panel. I also have in studio Michael Kraemer, who's also on those videos and I think a couple others as well. And so these guys know Russia pretty well, so I figured I'd bring them on to talk about this. And I think we'll just start off with a meme here, just to lighten the mood, since obviously a lot of the news out of Ukraine has been a little heavy, especially the shelling of that island and the death of an entire garrison. So when I first texted Dreeze about this incident, he actually sent me a GIF of the Bill Paxton Game Over Man meme. So anyway, so why did you choose that meme to represent the situation, John?
I think it's there is this kind of just like general sense of dread about this whole situation because I don't think I just kind of like being on Twitter and on Facebook and like my own self, I don't think anyone really expected Putin to quite go this far to like launch an actual invasion. I kind of thought that Putin would just saber rattle. He'd move troops around a little bit. I think earlier this week, or maybe late last week, Macron, the president of France, was saying, or maybe it was Biden, that they had agreed to like a tentative conference with Putin, and so I thought like, oh, they're probably going to sit down and go back and forth about things, and drag this out. Nothing will happen. Putin will continue to be a hardliner, and then I assumed that it would just kind of die down in the media, kind of like how Afghanistan was like this huge colossal disaster, this international relations disaster last year, and now it's kind of old news. So the actual invasion happening, I was reading it was on Wednesday night, and I was reading Zelensky's speech he had given. He'd given part of it in Ukrainian and part in Russian, and then one of my a fellow Russian history professor texted me, and he was like, "Holy shit, guys! Putin just declared war on Russia, or on Ukraine," and I was like, "No way, no way!" And then I looked, and it was like, "Oh, fuck!" And it feels like game over. I mean, I was definitely being a little funny there, but like kind of a little bit of the end of the post World War II kind of peace and order to Europe, or maybe the end of like kind of the post Cold War order to Europe, or just it felt like the end of something and the start of like kind of just real this kind of level of uncertainty, like we're not sure what's going to happen.
Right. I get what you mean, and also, Michael, so I understand that this has pretty much fucked up your plans for this year.
Yeah. So I was set to go to Russia at some point this spring, originally this winter, before the Omicron wave hit. I don't think I'm going. What do you think, Dreeze? Do you think I make it to Russia for my before I get my dissertation done, or you think this is game over?
It might just be game over.
That's kind of my take.
I was actually supposed to go to Kazakhstan this summer.
Oh,
and there was a whole revolution in Kazakhstan in January, and up until like a week ago, it was impossible to get a visa to go to Kazakhstan. And I had kind of written it off until about a week ago, and I was like, maybe it's still possible to go this summer. And then all this happened, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to stay out of the former Soviet Union for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that's yeah. It's my take too. Like, I mean, I think even, I don't know about you, I think even if I was able to get a visa, I don't know if I want to go right now. Like, yeah. Because, after the U.S. does all these sanctions on, Russian officials, there's going to be a tit for tat, and I don't know. It doesn't seem like it will be safe for Americans in Russia for the foreseeable future.
I don't think it's safe for Russians in Russia for right now.
The chat is complaining about somebody's mic. I'm not sure whose.
Uh-oh. Is it mine?
I don't think so. I think that might be Dreeze's, but I'm not sure.
Uh-oh. What is the chat saying? I don't see it in front of me.
It said there's an echo, but I don't really hear it on my end. And do you hear any echo?
No.
Okay.
Hang on, let me check my settings here.
Yeah. If whoever's in the chat hearing the echo, if you could say for which person you hear the echo on, then we can make some adjustments.
Oh, they're talking about Dreeze.
Oh, okay.
The guy said the guy from Iowa.
Okay. Cool. Well, we'll try that out.
Uh-oh.
He said he's robotic. That might be an internet speed issue.
I think it might. Yeah, it might be an internet.
What
I mean,
causes that.
Yeah, you sound a little bit robotic to me, Dreeze, but nothing too bad. So I don't think it's terrible.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I think what I'll do is adjust your volume just a little bit and see if that helps. If I make it a little bit.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure what it is. I just put push to talk on, so maybe I'm getting some background or some feedback I don't know about.
You're sounding pretty good to me right now.
Yeah, I reduced your volume some. That might do it, because sometimes if things are... the echoing can occur if it's really loud.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, but also sometimes, depending on what stream it's on, I have to adjust different people's volume.
Yeah.
Not sure why. Yeah, so anyway, I think that should help some, hopefully. People will let us know if it doesn't, I guess.
Yeah. Anyway, there's actually something I want to talk about that I found kind of interesting, because Dreeze, you mentioned how you were really caught off guard on the invasion.
Mm-hmm, right.
And I was reading a thread from someone who works in the defense industry, and he was talking about among defense analysts, they were much more sort of hawkish about an invasion, or predicting that an invasion was going to happen, than foreign policy analysts and scholars. And because I was also pretty surprised, right? And what he said was he made a very interesting argument that basically lots of foreign policy experts were looking at this and they're like, this is not in Russia's interest, right? like economically, militarily, politically, this is not a smart decision. It's a pretty damn dumb decision. And so, Russianists and foreign policy experts were looking at this to be like, well, why the hell would they do this? Whereas defense experts were saying to mobilize 150,000 troops and keep them in the field, and to do so for that long, you have to use them, because you're racking up, like millions and millions of dollars in costs every single day that they're out in the field, right? And I hadn't thought about that until I read that, and it made a lot of sense, actually. That might have been why defense analysts were much more worried about this happening. But one thing I wanted to get into in the stream is just like what we think the costs are for Russia, because I feel like over the past 3 days those costs have like multiplied and added up to the point where I don't know what Russia looks like after this. I mean, we'll see, but it's not going too well for them.
I actually have some information that could be helpful for that. Hopefully my sound's a bit better now. But I saw this. Someone brought this Twitter thread up to me, and it purported to be kind of minutes from or like information from a meeting, or like what Putin was up to. And apparently Putin is in some kind of compound, presumably heavily fortified, right, in the Ural Mountains, that a lot of the oligarchs are there and that they're not allowed to leave. It's because he doesn't want them fleeing the country, kind of some like Louis XIV keeping the sons of noblemen at Versailles type shit. And 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 this kind of this information, and again, I don't know if it's actually true. It said that there wasn't a whole, like, they were just hoping to like blitzkrieg into Ukraine and kind of like bum rush the Ukrainian army and it be over, and like in Kiev in within a day or two, and like that was the plan.
Right.
Like,
right.
and apparently this, again, it's unverified. Like this war so far is costing Putin about $20 billion a day.
Good Lord, and that doesn't even count into effect the pure casualties that the army has suffered in terms of men and material, and the fact that the sanctions are just getting approved and just getting rolled out, and the sanctions are going to be devastating. Yeah, and actually I was just thinking on the stream, it might be useful. I don't know how much listeners have paid attention to the news and looked at the maps. It might be useful to just give a sort of a rundown as to what's happened so far and what the Russian plan of attack was. And this was something I was studying a lot yesterday. So feel free to jump in whenever you want, but I just wanted to throw out some of those general assessments. So their plan was an invasion from Belarus, an invasion from the east through Donetsk and Luhansk, and then an invasion from the south from the Crimean Peninsula. And all of those to essentially link up, take the entire eastern half of Ukraine, take Kyiv, and then at that point presumably set up a puppet government after they find and execute the members of the current government. And if you look at the map and you look at like where they're at now, they've essentially failed at almost every single objective. So Kharkiv in the northeast is still held. A smaller city that was not expected to offer any resistance, Sumy, is still held. They made a push towards Kyiv, but they haven't successfully surrounded the city yet. They made a push towards these towns in the south, but they haven't successfully taken them yet either. And their forces haven't really gone much westward from Donetsk and Luhansk. I don't think they've even taken Mariupol yet. So basically, the Ukrainians haven't lost a major city yet. Go ahead, Dreeze.
Yeah, I think you're pretty right there. They're attacking on this like multi-front access, like from Belarus to Kiev, from like out of the Crimean Peninsula and kind of towards Kharkov in the east. And I think I think they really expected it to be easy, like going into like South Ossetia and Abkhazia, like they did in Georgia in 2008. And I think the Russians have grossly underestimated the potential of the Ukrainian military.
Yeah, I mean, they don't even have full air superiority, which I find shocking. Like,
that is pretty shocking, especially because earlier, Michael's been here for a while now. We watched this random video on YouTube of the top military powers in 2022, and that video said that Russia is more militarily powerful than China. So that take did not age very well.
No.
Well, I think there's a bit of kind of Putin believing his own propaganda, because there is this, he's invested heavily in modernizing certain parts of the Russian military. He's there's this kind of image of like the Spetsnaz, like elite special ops, black forces, and Putin has won kind of these small kind of little border wars over the past few years. Like he stomped on the Georgians in 2008. He took Crimea without really firing a shot in 2014, and the same with parts of Luhansk and Donetsk in the east. Like those were, quote unquote, those were not Russian soldiers. They were local patriots or concerned citizens, who were concerned about supposed persecution of Russians, but they and I say that sarcastically, but I think there had been this image of the Soviet military, or the Russian military, kind of having its shit together, and this is showing that it very much does not have its shit together.
it, and these are major battlefield defeats here. So pretty well trained Russian paratroopers dropped in on two different airfields in Ukraine. One, the airport outside of Kyiv, early in the conflict. They took it temporarily. Oh yeah, right, yeah, Ostamel. They took it temporarily and then got wiped out. Then they tried the same thing at Misleading. I think it was called Misleading. It's like a small town about 40 minutes south of Kyiv. In an overnight attack, not this night but last night, same thing. They dropped it down in an airfield and got completely wiped out. And these are supposedly they're very well trained units, right? And then a tank column in the southeast got 56 tanks got completely destroyed just a few hours ago.
Right, so hot take, but I believe that there are some people helping the Ukrainians who are not in uniform and are not from Ukraine.
That is a hot take.
I'll leave it at that, because for that many tanks to get destroyed,
I was shocked. I mean, it's possible it's misinformation, but it.
Those are like some World War II Eastern Front numbers. Like, it's like, oh yeah, today we had 56 tanks, blown up. And I don't think, I don't think the U.S. has lost 56 tanks since the Second World War in one day. But no, it's like there's something very. I mean, it's quite different from the Eastern Front. But like this is like kind of old. It feels like kind of an older form of warfare that we're not quite used to, at least from our American and Eurocentric perspective. And it's like holy shit! Like it's a full-on invasion, but the Ukrainians are really holding their ground. And I think I didn't think Putin would invade, and I was kind of like, if he does, I'm not sure if the Ukrainians can hold the ground, but they apparently are. And it's just and your comment about the air superiority. I know the big weak spot of the Ukrainian military was that their air force was just a fraction of the size of what the Russians could throw up, and they don't have total air superiority, and they're hurting. It's difficult to get accurate casualty figures at this point in time, but they seem to be, I think someone commented the Russians lost in the first 3 days of fighting the amount of men we lost in Afghanistan or Iraq in 20 years.
Yeah, I think the numbers were pretty similar. So there are numbers put out by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. So again, take all of the sources and all the specific information we're giving you guys right now with a big grain of salt, right? Because Western media is getting access to the Ukrainian propaganda side of this, right? But they put out a number that they shot down 14 Russian fighter planes, which is that's a lot. That's kind of shocking in 3 days of fighting, right?
Yeah, probably SAMs or something like that.
Yeah. And so Dreeze, I completely agree. It's pretty surprising. And it very much is a conventional war. It's interesting because there was I think just 2 years ago, there was that conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where it was the first use of drone swarms against tanks that was very effective by Azerbaijan, and everyone was like, this is 21st century warfare, it's completely different, we're never going to see a normal conventional war again, and yet here we are, and we got a normal conventional war, right?
And it's even it's interesting to hear about the kind of the number of casualties being inflicted. What is it? The big Ilyushin 76 or the IL-76. Those are big kind of four-engine transport planes, which can hold, I think 100 or up to 200 soldiers or paratroopers, depending on configuration. And Ukrainians have shot down several of those, presumably with the deaths of the crew and the paratroopers inside them. And it's just oh, holy crap! This isn't hit and run, low intensity warfare. It's nothing like what we saw I think from the perspective we're seeing, it's not like what we saw in Donetsk and Luhansk over the past few years. This is full-on invasion stuff, and I don't think anyone really kind of expected this.
Yeah, and it's shocking, and the bloodshed is very high, and number of casualties is very high on both sides. And the scary part about this is, and the really tragic part about this, it's only going to get worse, because as the Russians try to press, try to get something out of this war, they're going to have to fight in the cities, and when that happens, you're going to have a lot of civilian casualties.
That's going to be a nightmare.
Yeah,
especially if so many Ukrainian civilians have taken up arms. I mean, even if the Russian military is underperformed, that's still going to mean that for every Russian soldier who dies, several Ukrainian civilians will also bite the bullet.
Yeah. And that is, by the way, that's starting right now. It's starting with a night raid right now with massive bombing in Kyiv. There are most of the...
Right, I've heard that.
Yeah. Most of the population currently right now are sitting in subway stations and bomb shelters trying to wait out the massive bombing raid in Kyiv. Presumably, the Russians will try to come in after this massive bombing raid and come into the city. And a lot of the Ukrainian army still left in the city will, engage in pretty vicious, urban combat. The casualty rates are going to get worse and worse and worse. And it's fucking tragic because, in my opinion, this was completely unnecessary. Russia's going to make themselves weaker, and they're going to get a lot of people killed for no goddamn reason.
Yeah, and kind of going back to this being like almost an older form of warfare, like a type of warfare that we didn't expect. I've been looking at the news, and I've been seeing how they are handing out automatic weapons, AK-47s or 74s, machine guns to regular civilians, and the civilians are tying yellow armbands to their arms. That sounds like some workers being marched out of Leningrad to go defend the city from the German invasion, or
Right.
some old World War II stuff. And it's it's one has to question the type of intelligence that Putin got, because this isn't just he's not fighting against the Ukrainian military of 2014, which just
Right.
kind of was in a situation where they didn't even fight for Crimea. This is there is a legacy in this part of the world from World War II of full-on partisan warfare. We saw it when the Germans invaded during World War One. We saw it big time in World War II. We even had Ukrainian nationalist groups fighting even after World War II in kind of the western parts of Ukraine for years
Right.
after the war, which was some pretty nasty stuff. And it's they're they know this type of warfare is possible, and the fact that they didn't expect it or see it, or the fact that Putin couldn't gauge enough opinion within Ukraine to know that, because I feel like even I was pretty tuned into this stuff before it really escalated, kind of just in the past couple of months. But even I could see Ukrainian national sentiment in a lot of the country has turned against the Russians,
Yep.
or at least the Russian Federation, Putin's government, because of the seizure of Crimea and the eastern territories. And it seems like Putin was nah, they're totally gonna, or at least he wanted to believe that they'd be welcome as liberators, or at the very least didn't think that there'd be this kind of people's or militia style defense rising up and stopping the invading Russians. But but it just seems like a gross miscalculation. And I kind of want to come back to that comment you made earlier about kind of how foreign affairs specialists and Russianists and Sovietists, they were kind of surprised by this, but defense analysts weren't. That's a I think that's a really interesting point, and I don't know if it's the fact that Putin spent all this money and was spending huge amounts of resources mobilizing and stationing and positioning these troops, that he was just kind of well, fuck it, let's go. or if it was like, kind of a macho thing where he's like, I can't back down. The really kind of macho thing to do would be to just be more aggressive or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's definitely the case, and I do think once you've mobilized that many troops, it makes backing down a more costly thing to do in terms of the face you're losing, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. The other thing is, I think they were looking for a clear provocation, and Ukraine never gave them one.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Well, I think I'm actually in the midst of teaching a freshman writing course, and we're looking at international relations from the lead up to World War I up to the start of World War II. And I talked a little bit about in kind of like in summer of 1914, where you had the like the people mobilizing and declaring war in short order, and kind of one reason why the war started so quickly, and I think before a lot of people realized they were at war, was because mobilization often meant like rapid activation of the army and the moving of the army across borders. And right. I told my students, like, even up until, I don't know if it was Tuesday or Wednesday of this past week, where I stumbled across a news report from DW, the German English source. Mm-hmm. And it said, like, Zelensky was really, he had ordered like a partial mobilization. And I told my students, like, this is, and based on the news analysis, this is what they were saying. Like, this is probably an instance of Zelensky not wanting to provoke Russia by, mobilizing, and Russia interpreting the mobilization as a declaration of war or as an overly aggressive action. So that's probably, that's part of its, the Ukrainians not giving the Russians a reason to attack. I think I think Zelensky, it was a coy move by Zelensky up until Putin decided to invade, and then like not mobilizing the Ukrainian military then became like a huge problem.
Right. Yeah. No. It was. I heard about that same source, and the parallels are kind of shocking. Like, right? Like, you wouldn't think the mobilization schedules of World War I are relevant to today, but here we are, right?
Right, and I also think that, I think Putin had been spoiling for a fight for a couple of weeks, because like Biden and I think Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, they were trying to preempt any, or at least like American intelligence was trying to preempt any kind of like false flag or agent provocateur situation, right, with the Russians finding a reason to attack. Because like I remember a couple times, I think Biden was like, we've got intelligence that Putin's definitely going to attack on this day, or we've got intelligence that they're trying to stage, saw a situation on camera where it looks like Ukrainians are doing something fishy. And they did that several times, and I actually remember listening to an NPR report being like, if the Americans or the British keep crying wolf like this, people aren't going to believe them after a while. Right. And I think it was probably actionable and good intelligence that they had, and that they were trying to preempt any false flag or provocation that Putin was trying to engineer. And I think, again, this is a bit of speculation, that Putin was finally just like, fuck it, let's invade. Right. This is bullshit. Yeah,
I mean, it sounds like that's kind of what he did. And actually, and Dreeze, you were mentioning earlier Putin's speech, and maybe this is a good time to bring that up, because it sounded kind of like a fuck it speech, right?
Oh, this speech. Let's see here. I have the English transcript in front of me. This speech, it was given, I think, on the February 21st in Moscow, or that's in Moscow time. And no, this speech, this rationale for invading Ukraine, it reads like a really bad freshman paper. Like, it is. It's the type of stuff you'd expect out of like the dictator of Turkmenistan, or it sounds kind of like some stuff out of North Korea. It's just like completely denying that Ukraine is its own country, saying that it's just like an offshoot of Russian culture and language. And what's really interesting is that he kind of waxes on, or not waxes, but rambles on about this. But he basically says that Ukraine was the creation of like Soviet nationality policy under Lenin and Stalin, and that they committed an error by establishing the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and that it's not a good thing. And I know some circles on the internet were kind of making a big deal about Putin criticizing Lenin and Stalin, and I made the joke before we went online this evening that this is like the second secret speech. Now Putin, Khrushchev was denouncing Stalin first, and now Khrushchev was denouncing Stalin first, and now Putin's denouncing Stalin. But it's nonsense. It is literal nonsense, and it's just this rambling nationalistic diatribe that is it goes on for pages. And then the evening that he actually declared war, it would have been Wednesday night in the United States and early Thursday morning in Russia, and I think he was saying things like, Ukraine is full of a bunch of Nazis, or a bunch of neo-Nazis, and it's just like, that's insane. Yeah, they're definitely problematic figures in Ukrainians' history in regards to the Nazis and the treatment of Jews. But the stuff he was saying was absurd. And it's just like even from the perspective of spin control. How do you get people to believe that? Zelensky's Jewish. Right. The president of the country that you're saying is full of Nazis, the guy is Jewish. I think his grandfather was a colonel in the Red Army during World War II. It's he was like an officer with medals and stuff. And it's just how is this believable? Even for arch pro Putinites in Russia, I feel just the disconnect from reality is so tremendous, and I think that it's a product of Putin kind of being exasperated. I think he had hoped that just by massing the army he could finagle some type of agreement of neutrality from Ukraine, it wouldn't join NATO, and I think he thought that he could intimidate the United States and NATO, and that didn't work. And then British and U.S. intelligence was calling out any false flag incident that he was trying to orchestrate to start the war, and that didn't work. And it was kind of where do I go from here? I either got to invade or I gotta demobilize my forces. And I'm with Putin's kind of ruling style and his appeal to machismo stuff, or just kind of that machismo macho rule from force or rule from a position of power. I think that and then that moment it just dictated finding some reason to invade, and he comes up with this horrifyingly nonsensical historical revisionism bullshit, and he goes to war. And it was shocking. I think I've said this 4 or 5 times now. It was shocking to hear Putin say this kind of stuff. This is some do you guys remember Baghdad Bob?
Oh yeah.
No, I don't remember.
He was the Iraqi propaganda minister, or I don't know, press secretary for Saddam Hussein, right when the second Gulf War started in 2003. If you go into Google and type in Baghdad Bob, he should come up. But he would give these press conferences in Baghdad and be like, "Oh, the American soldiers are committing suicide in the hundreds outside the gates of Baghdad." When in reality had fleets of Humvees and M1 Abrams tanks, only about 50 miles down the road, steamrolling into the city. And it was of course just straight up propaganda nonsense. And to hear Putin talking like that, Putin, everything's kind of slanted and gears towards a Russian-centric, nationalistic perspective. But to hear some blatant nonsense like this, it was shocking, I thought, even for him.
Yeah, no, I agree. It really was shocking. And it's, I've heard, I don't want to get too deep down this rabbit hole, but I've heard he's also kind of, since COVID started, locked himself in a bunker. And I
have heard that.
You do wonder personally how much, I mean, since Sean's not here, I feel like Sean would focus in on this, like how much sort of like personal paranoia is going on in his mind, and how this is affecting his decision making skills, and this might be.
Oh, I'm sure it's playing a factor, because like he's been like isolated from. Well, I mean, he's a leader. He's always isolated from the people. But even since COVID, he's been in like this quarantine in like these fancy estates or bunkers or what have you. And you can definitely see that in him. Like, I can't remember which speech it was. It might have been this long speech about Ukraine, being the mistake of Lenin and Stalin. But when he was giving that speech on television, like he was sitting at this like enormous desk, and it was like literally like 50 or 60 yards away from the other people in the meeting. And I was like, that's a weird setup there. And I guess, it's for social distancing and whatnot, but that feels like a manifestation of the isolation that Putin is in right now. Because like I've heard those same rumors that he is like he's even cut off from a lot of government advisors and specialists and analysts, and that the only people who are around him are the ones who are like, no, the West is plotting against us, the West is attacking, we should maintain a hard line. And I'm sure I think his decision making is warped to some extent, like, because he thought this was a good idea, and I feel like from like a military defense perspective of like having so many soldiers in the field consuming resources, it made sense to attack solely from that perspective. But from like the larger kind of geostrategic political perspective, this just seems like it's making everything worse.
Yeah, it's really nuts. And actually, this was something I wanted to talk about, is sort of Russia's relationships in the world and where Russia was at before this invasion. Because things were going pretty well for Russia before they decided to do this, right? Like, they had that...
Right. I think... Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, they had that peacekeeping quote-unquote mission in Ukraine... in Kazakhstan. They had secure Belarus as Belarus had always been a strong ally, but even a stauncher ally than before. And then the SPD political party in Germany was just elected. They historically have pro-Russian sympathies. They were supporting Nord Stream 2. And there was even some positive talk of Germany wavering in NATO and becoming more aligned with Russia. I mean,
right, and to add to that point, I think that simply having the Russian army on the border of Ukraine in a position to possibly invade, I felt that gave Putin a lot of leverage that he lost when he actually did invade.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's gone from that to suddenly Germany, which was trending in Russia's direction, right? Nord Stream 2 is canceled. It's gone. That's a big deal. That's a lot of potential Russian economic gain.
Absolutely.
In the future gone. Germany's now supporting kicking Russia off SWIFT and cutting them off of international financial transactions. And Germany's sending their arms to support Ukrainians, which is insane.
Right, yeah. That was a big deal up until today. Germany was like, yeah, let's send them helmets and first aid kits and stuff. But today, there's the news report saying they're sending them I think they're RPGs or Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, and they're kicking Russia off SWIFT for that kind of international monetary transfer program, and it's this is. This is not helping at all, and even on Thursday in Russia when the invasion began, the Russian stock market collapsed. It plunged, I think 40%, and evened out at and I think the loss was lessened to about 30% by the end of the day. But they had to flip their equivalent of the circuit breakers, or turn the computers off so that they would stop trading, because if they kept trading, the whole economy might give out, and it just seems this is, it's what, and it's is taking you, and I think this raises an interesting question, because this does seem like surprising. This does seem like the really not great thing to do. But the question is, I think, what's Putin's logic here? Does he actually believe that invading and occupying Ukraine, overthrowing the government in Kiev, installing a puppet president or dictator there, is it worth all that he's given up? And if it was easy, if they were in downtown Kiev in within a day or two, maybe. But the fact that the Ukrainian army is standing up and holding them back, this is just turning into a huge clusterfuck.
And the scary thing for both the people of Ukraine, and I will say for the poor conscripts in the Russian army who had no choice in this, right? There's no simple solution here. If Russia chooses to fight this to the death, and says we're taking Kyiv, we're taking Ukraine, and keep this occupation up, it doesn't look. I don't know about you guys. It doesn't look to me like Ukrainians are folding anytime soon. It looks like they're settling in for, even if Kyiv falls, for guerrilla warfare against this puppet regime for years to come. So
oh yeah, definitely. No, it's Kiev is just one big. It's the biggest city, but there's lots of parts of Ukraine that the Russians haven't occupied, and if Kiev does fall, then they're still going to be fighting in the Lviv or in Kharkov and in tons of other places.
And I want to just say, from a military perspective, that is a optimistic scenario for Russia at this point, right? Their optimistic scenario is a grinding war with Western Ukraine that lasts years. Because
it's I think Putin was just hoping to blitzkrieg in, just like he kind of did with Crimea, and I don't know what, he must have got some really fucked up intelligence or thought he was, or maybe, Here's some out and out speculation, comparing it to my favorite Soviet dictator, Comrade Stalin. Is he surrounded by yes men and sycophants to the point where they just tell him everything that he wants to hear? That they're oh no, Vladimir Vladimirovich, this is, the government in Kiev is totally corrupt. The Ukrainian people will, or most of them will, accept or be sympathetic or not interfere with a Russian invasion. And maybe Putin's isolation has exacerbated that. Maybe Putin thinks 20 odd years as the head of Russia that he thinks he's God's gift to humanity. Who knows?
So I heard one thing recently, as the war started to prove bloody even for the Russians. Is it true that they have something of a demographic crisis right now when it comes to young men of military age?
Russia in general has a demographic crisis.
Yes, it does.
So I would presume so, because they've been losing population consistently for 20 years now.
The only major population increases Russia has had was when they annexed Crimea.
Oh my god!
And their population went up by I think it was a million or 2 million people in Crimea. But no, this is a continuing trend from the Soviet period. At the kind of the tail end of the Soviet Union, the only regions of the country that were experiencing dynamic population growth was Central Asia and the Caucasus, majority Muslim and Islamic regions, because in Islam they prioritize having large families. And I think, and especially in the 90s, the standard of living fell, the average age of men especially fell, largely due to rampant alcoholism, but also there's lack of health care and just kind of the social safety net in the 90s. And I think in the past couple of years, the population decline has leveled off a little bit. I don't think it's as dire as it was, 8 or 9 years ago. But by that, I mean the population decline has slowed down or stopped in a couple of areas. That doesn't mean the population is actively increasing. So, and it's I also think it's interesting to note, like, at the very end of the Soviet period, it had about, if I'm recalling correctly, and I'm kind of pulling numbers out of, I'm trying to reference numbers I saw once, but I might be mistaken. The population of the USSR was just under 300 million.
Wow.
And now the Russian population is around 145 million, I believe. So, like, it's about half the population. Like the Russian Federation is demographically much weaker than the old Soviet Union was. It's militarily much weaker than the Soviet Union was, like, at least from a sheer numbers perspective. And yeah, there is, they're big, they're large and in charge to an extent. But I don't think they can. I don't think they can wage like a long, World War II style war where they're just throwing men and tanks into the battlefield and relying, on competent military strategy, but also relying on industry and demographics for them to win a war.
Yeah, and 2 points on that actually. So thinking about the sort of average age of the Russian, someone serving in the Russian army right now, say if they're in their mid-20s. They would have been born around 1997 in the depths of the 90s crisis, right? And I don't have birth certificate or statistics right now in front of me, but I can't imagine that the cohort born in the late 90s is pretty big, right? Like, people, there's usually not population booms and economic depressions. So demographically they're not in a great spot. And
I think they're in a better spot than Ukraine, because Ukraine was going through that same stuff as well.
Right.
But so it's, who knows? But I think the larger point here is, like, they're not the Soviet Union. They don't have unlimited amounts of manpower or weaponry. They've got a lot, more than Ukraine, but not unlimited.
Yeah, and the other thing I think is important to talk about here as well is the sort of financial resources of Russia and the limitations that might come into place. So before this war, Putin and the Russian government created reserves of $600 billion in foreign currency. And so the idea was, if sanctions hit, then you're going to have a bunch of reserves that can you can send into the economy and keep the economy afloat for, several months to maybe a year, right? Well, the problem with that is, and this is really silly, they definitely overlooked this, was most of those reserves are actually held abroad. They aren't held in Russia. And there's talk now in the U.S. and among Western European countries about seizing those reserves and going into the banks and essentially preventing Russia from accessing them. And it was like, I think 3/5 or something of the reserves are not held in Russia. So that's $400 billion, something like that. Like, this is
that's a huge issue. Like Putin and the oligarchs, and even like the official Russian financial reserves, a lot of it are held outside of Russia. And I actually, when I teach my Central Asian class, we read a book specifically on this. It's called I forget the author's name, but it's called Dictators Without Borders. And it's focused mainly amongst the various dictatorships and dictatorships and dictators and oligarchs in Central Asia. But the main thesis is that, like people like Nazarbayev or Berdi Muhammadiev in Turkmenistan, or Islam Karimov, the old, his family and the old dictator in Uzbekistan, they relied heavily on the deregulated and undersupervised foreign financial aid markets to move money around through dummy corporations and accounts to siphon off billions of dollars from their country, store them in Swiss bank accounts or in the Cayman Islands, and that produced a huge amount of power and the kind of using foreign financial institutions to prop up kind of cronies in their homeland, but also to have a lot of wealth and power to exercise outside of their own countries. And this book, again, Dictators Without Borders is what it's called. It noted that, like, they would use the wealth to kind of go after political enemies outside of their countries. They would even manipulate institutions like Interpol, the international policing organization, to like harass and go after people who they saw as enemies of their regime. And the authors of this book, they were like, yeah, the reason why the dictators can do this is because the United States, Great Britain, other Western countries, there is this constant trend of deregulating these financial institutions, and when they're deregulated, there's no oversight, which means like people who have tremendous amounts of money can, do a lot of stuff with that money, can hide it. The banks, we know banks are willing to, to lie, to hide, to steal if you have enough money if you have enough money, and it's kind of this, I think there was some kind of there was some revelation about this larger like this international financial system with like the Panama Papers, and some of this stuff has come to light, but it's like, it is a huge source of wealth and power for like the oligarchs living throughout the former Soviet Union, and it's, uncomfortably it's a source of wealth and power for a lot of elites in the United States and in Western Europe. But no, like if we want to get serious about this, and I think there are a couple articles in like the New York Times or the Atlantic have echoed this. Like, if you want to get serious about reining in Putin's like wealth and power, it is to go after, and more heavily regulate these international financial organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's I've heard some of the same sources in terms of that, and that's really interesting. That I'm gonna have to check out that book, but the number of these Russian oligarchs who are not only hiding their money in financial markets, they're hiding their money in real estate in New York City and Miami and London.
Oh yeah.
Which, I mean, ironically, some of the most expensive cities in the world where people are struggling living, we could seize all their shit, lower prices in the real estate market, and help Americans here. Like, I don't know, I feel like that'd be a great policy for everyone involved,
it's
right?
also interesting.
Now, Mike. Private property in the United States is inviolable. You can't seize another person's private property, even if it's owned by a foreign dictator who heavily represses and steals from his own people.
Well, see,
everyone has right.
It's funny we're on the financial side of this whole conflict, because you remember, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of kind of universal free trade, the opening up of markets around the world, there were a lot of people pushing that, not just for the economics of it, but also because the idea being that if all the markets are interwoven, you can't really fight a war without fucking everything up. There's just too much money to be made for anyone to really risk going to war. And actually, it's interesting because we're kind of seeing that play out a little bit now, because actually the pressure that Biden's under from the donor class here in America is to not go to Ukraine, to not put troops there, because they don't want Russian oil to stop flowing into Europe.
Jeez.
That's a very interesting argument to make, and it's interesting because that's been made before. There was a British author named Norman Angell who was writing before the First World War, and actually I actually assigned some of his writings in the class I'm currently teaching, where he basically said something along the lines of, war is not profitable. Going to war, fighting over lands and territories results, it's too much of a financial burden. Countries are too interconnected economically. And he's talking about like the very early 20th century, before 1914. And he's saying that, like, hopefully things will develop with the economy so that the economy is that the countries are so interconnected economically that the rationale for going to war will no longer be there. And his ideas, they kind of went out the window with, the start of the First World War in 1914. But at the same time, his ideas were kind of justified because, Europe was horribly bankrupt financially as well as, emotionally after World War One.
Right. And I think, what we're seeing in Ukraine right now serves as an important lesson. Anyone making an argument that China will never invade Taiwan because it would mean rupturing tons of economic links between China and the United States, let's throw that out the window now. Like that could easily happen, and it could happen due to political reasons and nationalistic reasons, and, you know, economic consequences be damned, right? Because it's effectively what Russia did here.
It could, yeah. No, I definitely think that's possible. Although, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm giving the Chinese a bit too much credit, or the Chinese, or the CCP, but I have to assume that they wouldn't approach Taiwan as in such a boneheaded way as like Putin apparently has.
You would think they would be more competent than this, right? Yeah. I mean, I
You would
agree.
think. You would think. I don't know though.
Yeah. But it also just goes to the fact that often we think of world leaders as rational actors, right? And I think this is very clearly disproven it. So yeah, I don't know.
Yes.
Anyway,
I agree.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I just searched my bookshelf. So I found the book, The Dictators Without Borders, Dictators Without Borders, Power and Money in Central Asia by Alexander Cooley and John Heathershaw. So It's good stuff.
Cool. Yeah, I'll definitely keep it in mind. That's great. So one thing I was curious, and this I feel like this might be helpful to the listeners right now, is Dreeze, what sources are you going to keep up on the conflict right now? What sources do you trust? What sources are you skeptical about? How do we make sure we're getting information that's not like propaganda on either side, and we're getting good factual reporting on this?
I'm getting a lot of my stuff from Twitter, which again is not the best because anyone can post anything on Twitter, but just kind of in the, I'm plugged into a lot of kind of they seem to be legitimate reporters. I follow a bunch of kind of like Russian and Soviet experts, and people like big name people, and I am skeptical of a lot of the stuff that I see on Twitter, but I think Twitter is the kind of the best avenue for really it can be a good avenue for knowing what's going on immediately. Again, is it actually happening? I don't know. But it's again it's just this live news feed, and I think it is quite difficult to kind of parse through the stuff, and what you see on here firsthand, everything you have to take with a bit of skepticism. And
right.
I think you should comparing what's on Twitter to what you see I like some good news, like some actual news sources that I do follow are like DW, the German language news agency. I follow French 24 or France 24, another English language news agency, and then I keep up to speed with New York Times and the Atlantic. Although by the time it filters to the New York Times, I feel like that information is usually pretty accurate by the time it filters its way through that. But it is. It's I think I was talking with Derek earlier today, and I sent him this film clip of Ramzan Kadyrov, who's the kind of Putin stooge ruling Chechnya, and he was saying, it would look like an Instagram or TikTok post, and he was saying something like, I saw the news reports and information about people, the government in Ukraine handing out weapons to lots of people, and I think it's a bad thing to support Ukraine. But it was he was said something along the lines of, we don't support the war in Ukraine, or something like that. I'd have to look exactly at what he said, but I think it turned out that it was a selectively edited clip of a larger piece of film in which he reiterates that his loyalty to Putin and his willingness to do what Putin says. Again, I think I've heard several narratives about that on Twitter and on some online news sources, and you can't really confirm or deny it just from what you see on Twitter. But I think you can. I think there's a lot of good information out there on Twitter, on the news sources, on Facebook, but there's a lot of crap, and which means if you're jonesing for news, and I've been definitely jonesing for news for days now, and I'm definitely kind of following the tweets a bit too much. I sent a link to Derek a few days ago of this kind of interactive map that kind of tracks and as close as real time as possible things happening in Ukraine. I'm kind of glued to that a lot of the time, and it's but no, it's difficult because there's been a lot of reports of like planes being shot down. You see videos of like destroyed columns of like tanks, and like Twitter definitely, at least the sources I'm looking at, they definitely it's all like mainly pro-Ukrainian stuff. You don't see a lot of pro-Russian stuff. You're seeing, at least from what I'm seeing, a lot of like pictures of like blown up Russian tanks, destroyed tank columns, even some pretty gruesome stuff like charred bodies and stuff, which probably shouldn't be on Twitter. But it's like, where are the blown up Ukrainian tanks? Where are the dead Ukrainians? Not that I want to see those, but if one looks, I think, solely at the stuff I've been seeing on Twitter, I think one can get a very distorted view of what's going on, because it's sounding very bad for the Russians and very good for the Ukrainians. But if you look at other, more established news sources like New York Times or The Atlantic, or even like kind of some of the mainstream stuff, ABC, NBC, I think it's beginning to filter that the Russian offensive has slowed down. That they were expecting things to be easier and happen more quickly, and it's not.
Right. Huh. No, that's interesting. Those are good sources to know. I mean, definitely I haven't looked at DW. I've been following a lot of the same stuff and noticing the very, very, very pro-Ukrainian sort of, I wouldn't like to say bias, but slant of Twitter, and getting a lot of my stuff off Twitter. A couple
right from Twitter's perspective, it's almost like the Ukrainians are about 2 days away from marching on Moscow.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting too, a lot of people in the chat are mentioning RT.
Oh God.
See, the thing about RT that's interesting though is that the bias is so abundantly obvious that you actually can use it.
Yeah, right.
Because it's not exactly hard to figure out, especially in foreign policy, because what they'll tell you is when they're looking for an example of someone who's a good guy, it's always whatever Russia's doing, and the bad guy is always Germany. Germany's the Satan of that foreign policy universe. Even if they're talking about American foreign policy, they get it hidden on Germany. But when it comes to U.S. domestic policy, RT is surprisingly good sometimes, which is weird because their foreign policy coverage is laughably propagandistic.
Nice.
Yeah, one source I did want to mention that's getting a lot of play is the Kyiv Independent. They have a lot of reporters on the ground, and
yes, I'm following them as well.
Yeah, and they have good access to the Ukrainian military. So anything the Ukrainian military puts out, they're putting out. So that's where you have to take it with a grain of salt, because of course the Ukrainian military's, pointing out what they want, but to get the Ukrainian perspective and the Ukrainian facts that they're getting out there, it's a very, very good source.
Yeah.
And then one other thing I wanted to mention about one good thing about the New York Times is while they might not have reporters in Kyiv, they do have lots of reporters on the borders, and especially in Poland. So if you want to learn anything about the refugee crisis and you want to get good, accurate information about it, New York Times is actually pretty good for that. So that's just something I wanted to mention as well.
And of course, reporting improves in quality as you have more time to process as this situation develops. Right. I mean, obviously, the earlier reporting will be the most suspect, but as time goes on, it will become clear what's been happening, what the relative casualty rates are. Those things will come into focus as we move forward, I think.
Yeah, and the thing I would also want to mention is be careful about videos. There have been lots of sort of fake videos put out, where they, say, here's a Ukrainian apartment complex being brutally bombed, and you find out it's actually from Gaza. Oops. Like, getting our war crimes mixed up here, right? But, so...
Right.
So be careful about videos, because people can alter and say what they are and steal them for other things. And so that's just something to keep in mind.
I was actually watching a video on Twitter yesterday, and it looked like these like Russian armored personnel carriers trying to ram through this barricade somewhere in Ukraine, and they were coming up to the barricade, and as soon as they got within range of the barricade, you had like, I don't know, 20 or 30 Molotov cocktails landing on them and lighting them up in a huge ball of flame. And I was like, oh, holy shit. And then someone noted, like, no, don't believe this. This is from, I think they said 2014 when the Russians invaded then in some of the eastern provinces. So no, I think film clips are really they're really tricky. Probably shouldn't be believed fully.
Yeah.
Although some of the things we are seeing are like fucked up as shit. Like again, like bodies, like like I've again, at least from like the kind of like the definitely pro Ukrainian slant on Twitter, you're seeing like these big convoys of like Russian trucks and tanks totally burned out. That's like some like what's that the highway to hell from the highway of death from Iraq. I was like during the first Gulf War, and I was like, holy shit, this looks just like that. And I'm pretty sure in Russia there are like you can do the same thing. You can like I'm pretty sure there are Russian news sources or who are on like whatever's on like Vkontakte being like, oh, look at all these burned out Ukrainian trucks and tanks. But it is like you're seeing like missiles hit skyscrapers and bombs going off, and like I think there were some images earlier today of like it looked like possibly paratroopers landing in Kiev. Some said that wasn't, but you just like seeing missiles hit buildings and seeing dead people on the streets, or seeing like militia people, like people like common civilians with just like an armband and an AK-47 and a couple magazines of ammunition, kind of like manning a barricade or like hiding behind a street corner. It's like, holy shit! Like this is some surreal stuff.
Oh, so maybe one of you guys will know this, but something I've been wondering about. So, does Ukraine have mandatory service? Like, so the civilians they're giving arms to, how much prior training have they had?
So they have a large reservist army. I don't know how much of it was mandatory, but also I'm not sure if they even needed to make it mandatory, because after 2014, there was this wave of patriotism and lots of people went in for training. And so I think I'm pretty sure the reservist army was like 500,000 to 1 million people have gotten some training over the past 6 to 7 years.
And the reason I asked that is because I've noticed when I typed in, because I was looking for a thumbnail for the video earlier, when I typed in Ukraine arming civilians, arming citizens, I noticed that there was that a lot of these pictures do feature women, and I know that women have combat roles in the Ukrainian military. But also I noticed that there's one woman in a white coat who appears in a number of these from different sources. So she appears in this New York Post thumbnail. She also appears in one from ABC. And there are different poses with her. So she was at this site. It looks like they did a whole photo shoot to show Ukraine training people. And I assume partly they released those photos as kind of a deterrent to the Russians to be like, if you come, a lot of us are armed, we will fight.
Yeah. The other thing, it's almost... whether it was mandatory service or not before this crisis is almost moot, because right now, if men between the ages of 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave the country, and so if they show up trying to leave the country, they're turned away and encouraged to go and join the fight. So there is a mass mobilization underway, getting people under arms, and the fact that Germany and a lot of other countries in Eastern Europe are shipping these arms now means you have both the people and the equipment to arm them, and so you're going to see the ranks of the Ukrainian army swell, I think, over the next few weeks.
And even if I imagine a lot of these people they're probably kind of taught how to at the very least disassemble an AK-47 or 74, how to shoot it, how to load it, maybe a couple things about like cover and maneuvering, and then sent along the way. And that's not a lot of training. but like in urban warfare, people with guns can they can pin down a lot of a lot of soldiers. They can be really effective if they're like in
Right.
high-rise apartment blocks shooting down, even if not accurately. They can deter the movement of Russian forces, or even just like there are lots of pictures floating around out there of like people in homes and businesses making like thousands or hundreds or thousands of Molotov cocktails all at once. You just gotta, you get a few dozen people throwing those on top of tanks, on top of, advancing soldiers or armored personnel carriers that can really fuck shit up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It looks like I assume the red are Russian troops. Looks like they might have broken through sort of the Crimean frontier here, because it looks like the Ukrainian forces are still sort of in position to try to hold the border, but the Russians have broken past. Around Kiev, I mean, clearly lots and lots of units. And then even in the east, it looks like some of the Russians might have... Well, most of these are bombings, not penetrations. It looks like they're also holed up on the border near Kharkiv, which I always thought was Kharkov. I guess this would be the more Ukrainian spelling of it.
I think I think Kharkov is the Russian and Kharkiv is the Ukrainian, and I definitely switch in between both. My professional language training's in Russian.
Right. Huh. And there's something else I wanted to just mention. So at OSU we had a sort of get together and meeting among a lot of the graduate students and professors and students in general who are sort of concerned over the Ukraine events. And there are many Ukrainian students at this meeting, and so sometimes we can talk about these events from afar. In that meeting alone, the number of people who had family or had family in Ukraine, and who knew people caught up in this, trying to desperately leave their homes, wasn't insignificant. They're talking about 16 family members or something and alone in this conversation. And I just want to emphasize, when you're watching this and you're seeing this stuff online and reading about this, these are real people's lives. People are trying to decide, do we take grandma who's 80 years old and do we leave, or do we shelter down and pray we don't get killed by a Russian airstrike? And it's serious. And there have already been 150,000 people displaced or not only displaced, but went into Poland as refugees. And depending on how long this conflict goes, you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of refugees who are going to need a new place to stay and a new home, frankly. And this crisis is something that doesn't... It will go out on the... this will probably go out on the news in 2 weeks if fighting calms down, right? But the consequences of this will happen for years and years and years and years and years. And it's going to matter what support we provide people 3 years from now. Not just today. And I just wanted to emphasize that, because sometimes when we look at stuff from afar that seems like it doesn't affect us, we can lose the sight that these are individuals with lives that very much like us, and it matters whether we provide ongoing support and care to people who've been displaced and hurt and killed in these conflicts. So
no, I agree. I think the kind of the follow-up humanitarian crisis and refugee crisis is going to be enormous. But I mean, there is already controversy over that. A few month or so ago, Belarus and Poland were having this huge fit over refugees and non-white, non-European refugees, and it got to the point where Polish and Belarusian border guards were building new fences and sophisticated border gates and all that, monitoring technology, and then all of a sudden we have this large Ukrainian refugee crisis, and it's I think it was I might have saw this somewhere. I did see this on Twitter. I'm not sure. Might have been the Bulgarian foreign minister. And the Bulgarians are like, yeah, we're thinking of taking in refugees. After all, these are fellow Europeans. And it was just kind of as if they're white, if they're Slavic, if they look like us, they sound like us, they talk like us, well, yeah, we would of course have room for them in Poland or in Bulgaria or in Romania or even Hungary maybe. But brown or black people, Muslims, non-Europeans, non-Christians from places not in Europe, oh no, sir, not here.
Yeah, it's pretty messed up. And I mean, the only thing I can hope is that the sympathy towards the Ukrainian people can be extended to other refugees all around the world who've been waiting in refugee camps for, sometimes dozens of years, right? Like, the number of refugees around the world right now is shocking. It's very, very high, or in the millions, at least. And, it's time we stepped up. And hopefully we can first, let's step up for the Ukrainians, and then let's step up for everyone else, too. So there's just a thought, if you ever think to yourself, what can I do to help? There are local refugee resettlement organizations everywhere in the United States. Get involved. Offer to host a refugee family, or offer to provide financial support for a refugee family. It makes a big difference. So anyway, this is just my little community service plug.
No, I definitely agree. 100% with that. And it's hopefully this spearheads some kind of more positive outlook and more help for refugees. Although it is interesting to see kind of Poland, and I think even I'm not sure if what Hungary's situation has been on taking in refugees from Ukraine, but these were countries that up until a week ago were no sir, we can't have no refugees here. But now when questions about defense, when NATO is when the rest of NATO is kind of breathing down your back, being like, hey, you're going to let these people in, right? Poland,
right?
You're going to let them in. You're going to welcome them with open arms, right? Because if you don't, you got 20 odd other countries are here with you who are going to get cranky, who they're going to start feeling some pressure. And I think because the Ukrainians are culturally related to the Poles, and to other Slavs, I think there was already that built-in sympathy there. But I think we're seeing some more right-wing anti-refugee governments like Hungary and Poland, closing ranks with NATO, realizing being kind of together as part of NATO or a larger European Union has its advantages. And you did have Eastern European countries kind of drifting closer to right-wing authoritarianism, closer to kind of Putin, and this kind of goes to the larger kind of cascade of effects that Putin just kind of ruined his relations with any kind of sympathetic right-wing government in Europe, because they're sure as hell not going to leave the European Union or ignore NATO when you have Russia ready and willing to invade a neighboring country.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I mean, and I just want to underscore this, I was having conversations with some of my college buddies just 3 weeks ago about how Europe is so damn weak and disunited. Many countries were moving towards Russia. It's pathetic. We can't trust them on financial matters, security matters, and Putin overnight just blew that up. We have a united Europe. We have a united Europe that's going to support integration, and that's going to be anti-Russian, and that's going to support increased defense spending.
Well, wow. I mean, they'll certainly support increased defense spending, and they'll be anti-Russian. I'm not sure how much cohesion they'll have beyond that, but I mean that's
there's
starting point.
We'll see.
I think yesterday Putin was making threatening comments towards Sweden and Finland, saying that Russia might intervene militarily if Sweden or Finland join NATO, because they're not members of NATO. I think they tried to occupy this kind of neutral zone during the Cold War, and when the Cold War ended, they didn't seem like moving or joining NATO seemed like its own the thing that wasn't necessary. But if I was the foreign minister of Sweden or Finland right now, I'd be like, holy shit, let's join NATO as quick as possible. Russia has clearly set the precedent of invading and wrecking the shit out of neighboring, bordering countries that don't agree politically with it. And I think that was. I was watching some mainstream news. It might have been NBC or ABC a couple of weeks ago, as the United States and other NATO members were slowly kind of moving military units to Eastern Europe. That, before Russia invaded, like small countries like the Baltic states, Romania, they were seeing the benefits of being part of NATO, where you had, other countries sending military units and sending defense units to defend you because they were compelled to under the collective security agreement that NATO has. If an attack on one is an attack on all, and I think it really hammered home how valuable membership in NATO is, and the Ukrainians they desperately want it, and
Right.
And so it's I think it is interesting to see what kind of unity there will be in Europe after this, because I would not at all be surprised if Finland and Sweden very quickly join NATO, maybe even Austria, who knows, because I don't think Austria is a member either.
Yeah, I think the same. They probably will, and frankly, they should. They absolutely should. Because
Definitely.
if the Baltic states weren't a part of NATO, 100%, I think Russia would have invaded them.
They'd be screwed. They would have been invaded like a decade ago.
Yeah, they absolutely would have. There's almost no doubt in my mind about that. And so, yeah, they absolutely should join NATO. And again, I always go back to this, but what a fuck up by Putin. What a fuck up, right? You got Germany against you. You might get even more countries joining NATO. All Putin literally had to do was threaten Ukraine, not invade, and hang out, and then watch Zelensky, like every other Western-oriented Ukrainian president, get mired down in corruption and eventually voted out of office.
Yeah, he just had to sit tight. That's he just had to not invade, and he seemed to choose the actual kind of wrong answer, and it's like a multiple choice question, which one of these is wrong or which one of these is inaccurate, and he chooses the one that's inaccurate or wrong.
Yeah, and maybe it's too early to make predictions and stuff, because I guess we don't know what's going to happen with this war. Who knows? Maybe the Russian military suddenly gets better and it does more things. But I feel like the consequences from this decision alone just are not going to be great for Russia. And frankly, I'm a little bit worried about Russia down the line 5-10 years from now, right? It doesn't seem like it's in a stable place. And instability in Russia is not a good thing for the rest of the world.
No, I think it's going to be nothing bad. I mean, I think people I tell my students this in my classes, Russia's poor as hell. Things the situation in Russia is not great outside of Moscow and Petersburg and Kazan. Russia is really damn poor. I spent some time in Volgograd, old Stalingrad, last time I was in Russia, and it's a sizable, it's a provincial capital. It's a sizable city. The war monuments and museums are cool as hell. And the largest statue of Lenin in the world is located south of Volgograd. But it's I was surprised at how things seem run down. Very run down for even a provincial capital. It's I would have expected a sizable city like Volgograd to be wealthier and in a better place, and it's not. And the government, the Russian government spends a lot of money on defense, trying to beef up its military. Although where exactly that beefing up went after its poor showing in Ukraine so far is who knows. Maybe it all went to Putin's Swiss bank accounts.
Right.
But no, I think Russia's not in a good place. financially, and I think it's only going to get worse after this. And
Yeah.
like, who knows what's going to happen? It's we saw some protests, some anti-war protests going on in Russia in the past few days, and very quickly you had the police in SWAT and riot gear starting to break them up, starting to arrest them very quickly, because Putin is terrified. Like the thing that he's like more terrified of than Ukraine becoming part of NATO is dissent and massive protests at home. And
Right.
like, again, like this kind of calls into question Putin's logic here, because from what I can tell from media, from Twitter, from the kind of the mainstream news sources, like, people in Russia aren't excited about this war. People don't want this. Like, they don't, they might have supported some of Putin's hardline maneuvering and saber rattling before to prevent Ukraine becoming part of NATO, but like, they didn't want to engage in a full-on invasion of Ukraine. And
Right.
just from what I've seen in the news, like, people aren't excited about this. And whether or not this manifests into, more dissent at home, or, God forbid, like, politicians or some of the oligarchs turning against Putin, I mean, who knows? Who knows? I think things would have to get worse before that happens. But it's or have either of you watched the series Homeland?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I did.
Well, I think it's in the penultimate season where they're like trying to get the main character out from like the FSB in Russia. One way they're able to do it is by freezing like some oligarch's money, where like hundreds of millions of dollars are suddenly not accessible to him, and the oligarch kind of loses his shit. Like, when you
Right.
cut them off from their money, they lose their shit. And which says a lot about money, but and then the power system. But like, now that, like, if there are hundreds of billions of dollars outside of Russia, no longer accessible by the Putin and the oligarchs will be like, what the fuck? I want my money. The most important thing to me is my money, and if Putin's actions are separating me from my money, maybe we won't tolerate Putin anymore, or maybe Putin's hold on power might weaken. I mean, who knows? Who knows? I think things would have to get worse before something like that happens. But yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that very well could happen. And on sort of Russian protests and stuff. So I think there was the daughter of the press secretary of Putin came out and on Instagram wrote "Niet vойне," no to war. This is the daughter of the damn press secretary.
I saw that.
Which is crazy. Like, and there are other prominent individuals who wrote the same stuff. Like, I think a Russian tennis star like said, "End the war in Ukraine," or "Please no to war." So like, these are prominent individuals who could be punished and are speaking out. And I don't think they would feel comfortable speaking out if they knew most elites in Russia supported this, right? So I don't know. It's not a great situation for Russia right now. And again, this is where we'll see what happens. I could see a scenario where Russia successfully takes Kyiv, and there's this big patriotic fervor that goes out, right, and changes the calculus. But I mean, and maybe this is something we should also talk about, is the propaganda war. I mean, man, Zelensky and the Ukrainians, I think, are winning the propaganda war in spades right now, right?
least
Oh,
on social
definitely,
media.
definitely, yeah. I think I
It looks like the right-wing social media is all in the tank for Putin, though.
Jeez.
Like, because somebody was saying that the best sources, somebody who was talking about some pro-Putin stuff, was mentioning Getter and some other things that are, pretty firmly on the right.
Wow.
But I mean, that comes back to the hyper-partisan nature of politics in the world today, especially in the West, and how everything has to have a partisan skew to it, no matter what it is.
Right.
Well, that kind of speaking of Zelensky and the propaganda war, I think Putin, the larger Ukrainian resistance movement, or the national government and the army, it could survive Kiev falling. But I think it could and it will, because I mean, as much as I would want Kyiv to keep holding, I don't know. Like the Russians are not, they're literally, it's the enemy at the gates here, and if Putin goes full caveman, which I think that's all he has left now, just swarming them with tanks and helicopters and just sending in more and more men. I definitely think it's possible that Kiev falls. But if Zelensky stays alive, though, if he remains, there and the president, I think he's a bigger part of this than even holding on to the capital, because he's shown himself to be very adept at like using social media to rally people around him, and he also personally has some serious, as my high school Latin teacher would say, some serious testicular fortitude. He's from everything you see online, he looks to be in the capital. He's wearing kind of military style fatigues, giving daily speeches, probably from a really deep bunker. But what's really striking is his approach towards the population in the Russian Federation. I think it would have been very easy for him to kind of universally condemn Russia, to universally condemn Russians. But on Wednesday night, and this speech came out a bit before Putin's kind of officially declared military operations in Ukraine. He gave the speech in Ukrainian to bolster morale and kind of the confidence of the Ukrainian people, and then he switched over to Russian, and he gave this long speech. It was a couple minutes. This speech addressing not Ukrainians or Russians in Ukraine, but specifically addressing Russians in the Russian Federation itself. And he basically said, hey, we understand the situation. I know most Russians are not excited about war. I know most Russians don't want to invade Ukraine. And he was like, look, we're not Nazis. I'm Jewish. My grandfather fought in the Red Army in the Second World War. My grandfather probably killed Nazis. And it's we're not bad people. We're simply different people. We are Ukrainians. We want to enjoy the same kind of rights and privileges and sovereignty that you in Russia, should or might enjoy. And I thought it was very moving, his kind of conciliatory kind of approach towards the Russians, or towards at least the Russian people. And he was also being like, the best thing for you guys to do is or he was basically calling on them to protest, to oppose the war, to stop this from happening, to prevent people from dying. The best thing you can do is to oppose the war and oppose Putin. And since Wednesday night when he gave that speech, I think he's given several other speeches in Ukrainian, but he switches to Russian and he's talking to the Russian people. I think the day that Putin invaded, Zelensky went back on the air and was talking in Russian, and he was like, I've seen the news reports of the protests in Russia, and it's clear that you guys are listening to us. It's clear that you guys are talking to us. Please continue. Please, protest, resist. Don't support the war. We're not the bad guys here. We just want to live and survive on our own.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it seems like it's a really effective approach. I mean, both for propaganda and both for just, winning public support in the West and in Ukraine and in Russia. And the one thing I want to say as well is, I think, God forbid, and I hope this doesn't happen, but I think if he's killed or captured, he'd become a martyr overnight for the Ukrainian people.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I think it's at that point, and it's just it's not going to be a scenario like in 2014 where Viktor Yanukovych, the former somewhat autocratic president who was sort of a Russian stooge by the end of his term, left his dacha in Kyiv, ran away, and left all of his money in Kyiv to be looted by the protesters, right? And this sort of embarrassing fleeing the capital. Zelensky saw, I think Zelensky saw that, and he was like, I cannot do that here. And it's winning the people's trust. And again, this is a guy who was not that popular before the invasion and before this crisis. His popularity numbers were like in the 30-40%, right? And
right, and he was a comedian and actor before all of this.
Right.
Like he didn't
So it's like
he
the
didn't
Al
have like a
Franken.
government or leadership background.
It was like the Al Franken of Ukraine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
in
now
some ways.
and now he's kind of turned into Ukraine's Churchill.
yeah, it's
Well, I guess a lot of it
shocking.
will depend on how things end, though, as to where
Yeah.
his status is. But I mean, obviously, he has made a name for himself, whereas otherwise he might have been forgotten. But yeah, it's
Yeah,
also,
and
I think it's funny. Somebody was talking about, well, think about all the good Putin's done for Russia. But the thing is, if you look at what Putin inherited from Yeltsin, which was a fucking mess. Fast forward to the present, still a fucking mess. All the same fundamental problems exist. What has Putin actually accomplished, honestly? Other than putting off a crisis.
So what I would argue is Putin successfully turned Russia into a petrostate, with all the strengths and weaknesses of a petrostate. So, if oil prices were high and gas prices were high, it brought some economic benefit to the economy. And if oil prices and gas prices were low, it completely fucked over their finances and the people. That's what he's done. The other thing he brought is some sense of stability to Russia, and some sense of national pride, which was lost with Yeltsin. And I vehemently disagree with a lot of what Putin's done, but like, if I'm analyzing it sort of as a historian, there's more national pride in Russia, and it's a petrostate. With all of the problems and weaknesses of both, is what I would say. I don't know what your take on that would be, Dreeze.
I would agree with that. Although I think a dirty secret of the late Soviet era was that the Soviet Union was a petrostate.
Yeah, no, that's
Like,
true. It's true.
And I think the collapse of the Soviet Union was I think Americans really like grossly underestimate how bad things got in Russia and the former Soviet Union in the 90s. Because we spent the whole decade high-fiving each other about how we won the Cold War and how the economy was booming, and then 9/11 happened and things got complicated. But Putin definitely, he brought back a sense of stability, returned national pride to the horrifying financial embarrassment that was the Yeltsin era. But I definitely think he Russia was very much a petrostate when it declared independence from the Soviet Union. But you're definitely right. I think Putin kind of consolidated that kind of petrostate nature, and it's the only thing besides weapons that Russia, and weapons and wheat, I think, are the really big cash exports in Russia, and probably some other foodstuffs as well. But no, yeah, it's like he returned stability. He definitely did improve the economy in kind of the first decade of the 21st century. But that kind of dynamic and economic growth, I mean, it was you had reached the point in the 90s where everything was bottoming out, and it almost was impossible to get lower. So, anyone in power and the economy would have gotten better, I think.
Right.
But I think a big reason why. I know Putin's popularity has definitely cooled down quite a bit in the last number of years because that economic growth has leveled off. It's not there anymore, and it was exacerbated by the sanctions that have been in place since 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, and it's going to get worse now. I think I'm not sure to what extent the Russians turned the stock market back on after things began to collapse on Thursday, but come Monday, if the markets open in Russia, I think it's going to be a colossal financial and economic disaster, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the 90s. And whether or not that'll be enough to affect change, whether or not Putin, there'll probably be some attempt at a bailout or market stabilization, which I think will fail, because I think the markets in Russia will be in free fall. the big thing that made Putin popular, the return to financial stability and financial growth, I think that's going to be out the window. I think one reason why authoritarian dictatorships survive and thrive is when the economy is booming, and the economy hasn't been booming in Russia for years, and it's not going to be booming now. It's going to be busy busting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing I want to mention was just the opportunity cost that Putin has imposed upon Russia by taking this petrostate, anti-Western, full-on stance, right? Like, I don't think Russia's economy is more complicated, and it's much and it was much larger at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. But like, I don't see there's any reason why Russia couldn't be doing as economically well as Poland or Bulgaria, right? But tying their entire economy to gas and oil is just not a great way at like consistent, stable like economic growth, right?
Well, I think it's part of a larger and incredibly tragic trend that we see in Russian history, where the elites, the leaders, the czars, the general secretaries, and now Putin, they do not prioritize the welfare of their people.
Yeah.
They don't care about the welfare of their people. I mean, they care to a point. But, what is most important, under the czars, the most important thing was holding on to autocratic power. Nicholas II shot himself in both of his feet because he couldn't fucking reform, and he lost everything. The Soviet Union was obsessed with holding on to power, the monopoly of power that the Communist Party had, and for right reasons. Like, as soon as Gorbachev loosened it, the whole thing lost legitimacy and fell apart. And Putin is the number one most important thing for Putin is not Ukraine, it's not the happiness of the Russian people, it's him holding on to power, to be the kind of sole authoritarian leader of the country. And Putin will go to any depth to make sure that he holds on to that power, including isolating the country and its people from the rest of the world, including crashing the Russian stock market, or getting involved in a horrible war in the Ukraine, or in Ukraine. It's just, his number one priority is holding on to power. That's hands down number one thing. And if he has to live with being an authoritarian president, with his country in poverty, with his isolated from the rest of the world, I mean, that's what the Soviet Union was in the 20s and 30s. And there's actual precedent for this. There's precedent for Russian leaders just driving their country into the ground as long as they hold on to power. I mean, it's we even with the Brezhnev and his generation, they propped the economy up with petrodollars, and they really heaped on the military aspect of the Soviet army. It was under Brezhnev we saw this kind of first big manifestation of the cult of the Great Patriotic War and the cult of Lenin during his 100th birthday in the 70s. They were so concerned with maintaining their privileged position in society, and the last thing they wanted to do was implement any kind of reforms, because reforms are messy. Reforms mean that the Communist Party might have to answer difficult questions about itself. It means that their plush position in the Soviet hierarchy might be threatened. And Brezhnev didn't want to do that. Brezhnev probably couldn't. He was mentally incapacitated by the late 70s, and it's the same thing now. Putin doesn't care about the Russian people. He cares about being the modern day czar of Russia, and I think it's blatant. We can see this kind of blatant disregard of what the Commonwealth or the welfare of the Russian people, with him just doing this horrible, stupid war. Maybe thinking that it's I've talked with the Russian language and Russian studies professor here on campus at Cornell over the past few days, kind of about all of this stuff, and it's there have been kind of echoes. There's echoes of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, where I think you had some actual government ministers, Russian ministers, being like, you know what Russia needs right now? Just a good, short, quick war. If we go in, stomp on the Japanese because we're better than them, this could rally the people around the czarist government. And again, I don't know what the hell Putin's thinking, but there's echoes of that here. We just have a quick war where we just launch a couple hundred tanks and steamroll through Kiev in a day or two. This could really rally the Russian people behind Putin and the government. And it's just like, holy crap. So I'm ranting now.
So I guess we're approaching the time you said you might want to leave.
Oh yeah.
So just a couple more questions to kind of bring us to a conclusion. So, how much willpower do you think that Putin and Russia have to see this through to a successful conclusion? Do you think that they will back off now that they're meeting with unexpected levels of resistance? Do you think they'll see it through? I mean, what do you think the level of willingness is to sustain casualties and these kind of international this international condemnation they're experiencing? Like, how much of this are they willing to take? So
I think there are two important factors we have to look at. First, do they capture Kyiv or not? That's a huge sort of morale boosting event for them, I think. And so if they're able to capture Kyiv, that might change the calculus pretty heavily. The other thing, let's see what happens with these financial sanctions, right? Because there's a bunch of different sanctions that are being in play. So first, the reserves of the Russian government. Second, the SWIFT system, and then thirdly, the targeted sanctions on Russian oligarchical assets around Western Europe. How hard do those hit? And how much does it move oligarchs' opinions to then pressure Putin to come to the negotiating table? I think those are the two big things. But I'm curious what you think, Dreeze.
I think I'm not sure. I think if I from the rumors that I've read online, Putin has the oligarchs cloistered with him in his kind of Urals doom fortress, and I think Putin has a firm control over the secret police, the FSB, the SVR, and he has shown that he's ready and willing to use the instruments of the secret police against the oligarchs.
Right.
I don't know to what I don't think the oligarchs without their money have a lot of power. So I guess how much money and power they have within the country, I think that might be a factor, though I'm not as well read up to the individual machinations of the oligarchs themselves. But I think Russia and Putin could hold out for a while. I think that they will throw everything they have to try to take Kiev. And I think ultimately, unless I think it's going to be a bit like the Winter War in that way. The Soviets, they ended the Winter War. It wasn't a glorious victory, but they eventually broke through a lot of the Finnish lines by just finally getting some competent officers, and just through sheer overwhelming numbers, and they brought Mannerheim to the negotiating table and got some border territories and provinces. I think Putin will throw everything he has, try to take Kiev, probably try to take Kharkov and some of the other major cities in eastern Ukraine, and then maybe try to negotiate from there, to go negotiate from some position of power. Because I feel like if he stops now, then I think stopping now, I think he should. I think he should end the war immediately. But I think stopping now would be, a disaster for him, because he couldn't save face if he pulls back to the Russian border or to where things were antebellum. I think it'd be a huge propaganda and leadership disaster for Putin. So I think he means to be in it to win it, and negotiate and try to again gain the big cities, maybe get rid of get rid of Zelensky, possibly assassinate him, kill him, and then once he occupies the big cities or gets rid of Zelensky or forces Zelensky to flee the country, which I don't think would happen anyway. Then he'll try to foster some type of negotiation, or at least begin serious calls to bring to the negotiating table. I definitely think that the finance thing, if this lasts longer, this draws out, I think the finance thing could really fuck Putin over, and I hope it does. But I think it depends on what happens militarily in the next few weeks.
And tell, I mean, at this point, do the Ukrainians even come to the negotiating table? Or do they just say, we're going to fight you to the freaking death, right? Like,
I don't think they will. I don't think the Ukrainians are in any mood to negotiate. And, they're handing out AK-47s to anyone who wants them. Like that's not a sign of a country that wants to negotiate. That's a sign of a country, again, that's old Soviet shit. Workers in Leningrad marching out of their factories to go fight the Germans. They are going to fight, many of them to the death, to stop this. And I don't think anyone wants to negotiate, because I feel any negotiated peace would probably be worse than the situation antebellum. And it's like, and they'd be vulnerable. Like Putin wouldn't accept anything less than Ukrainian neutrality and some kind of economic or socio-political control over the country, and like no one in Ukraine wants that. So like I think Putin will try to take the big cities. I think he will use that as a position to try and negotiate. I think the Ukrainians will tell him no, and unless Putin pulls out or agrees to an armistice or ceasefire, I think the whole country will probably devolve into a guerrilla war of some kind.
Jeez, and I think that's another thing that's kind of key about this is Putin's goal here was a neutral or pro-Russian Ukrainian government. And yeah, I agree with you, Dreeze. The Ukrainians aren't ever going to give that up, especially after what happened. The Ukrainians are going to be pro-Western for generations to come after this, honestly.
Yes. Putin lost the propaganda war a long time ago. He lost it, I think, in 2014 with all those shenanigans with Crimea and the eastern provinces.
Yeah. So, I mean, Putin coming out of this war with Mariupol and a Ukrainian government that's pro-Western and a part of the EU is a failure for Russian political goals. But it might be enough for him to save face down the line after, he and his army have killed hundreds of thousands, at this rate, hundreds of thousands of people, right? Like, it's just wild.
Well, I feel like that's another thing that Putin won't be walking away easily from this. Like this isn't. There are a lot of civilians dying. Like we're seeing, images in the news of rockets hitting like apartment complexes and apartment towers, and like there was reports today that Russian artillery or rockets hit a children's cancer hospital in the center of Kiev, and it's just like it's. Civilians are being killed. Orphanages and children's hospitals are being hit with ballistic missiles. Like, and this stuff will filter back to Russia. Like, it is filtering back, even though they've tried to shut down Instagram and Facebook in Russia itself. And he just looks like a butcher. He is a butcher, and even if he is able to take Kiev and some of the big cities, Kharkov or Kharkiv, or maybe he takes the eastern half of the country up to the Dnieper. I don't know. I think he has permanently, and whether or not he's able to remain in power, who knows? I think he has permanently damaged his image in the eyes of the world stage and in the eyes of many Russians at home.
Yeah, I agree.
I feel like Kharkov is probably untenable just because of how close it is to the border.
Yeah.
I think that the time on that one, in terms of the Ukrainians being able to hold it, pretty limited. It looks like the Ukrainians are pouring 100% effort into holding Kyiv, so that might be possible. The problem is, if you look at the map, the Russians do seem to have effected a breakthrough in the south with tanks. So that means that they can drive up and potentially attack Kyiv in a pincer, cut it off from any kind of food or outside resources. So if they're willing to press long enough and hard enough, they can probably take it, but it would most likely take way more casualties than would be worth it.
And that's the other thing is, how many troops did they lose in horrific urban combat? And and I think this is just something else to add. And not to say I agree with any of this, but like Kyiv is not like Yemen, right? It's not like Syria. Like because of the very pro-Western and in some ways like racist conceptions of Western media, like seeing historic churches bombed out and destroyed in Kyiv is gonna create a very different response than seeing blown up mosques in the Middle East, right? And the type of urban warfare that Russia's gonna have to do to secure Kyiv, they're gonna have to turn it into fucking Grozny on live television for months.
And in the internet age, I feel like they were able to get away with Grozny because Chechnya, because it was the 90s, you didn't have the internet like we did now, and because it was in Russia itself. I feel like there was a level of containment or layering that like where the hell is Chechnya? What is Chechnya? I felt like it was isolated enough within Russia. There wasn't enough media presence, but now it's you're definitely right. People aren't going to tolerate tanks blowing up gold dome churches in Kiev.
Yeah.
But before we go, I did want to note one thing that was really terrifying: the fighting that took place around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant.
Oh my god!
I heard that and I was like, holy shit! It's just like Stalker.
Yeah, that was wild, and thankfully nothing came of that. There's also another radioactive containment plant that was shot by a missile. Thankfully, it did not breach the tanks. This is right
Jesus
outside
Christ.
of Kyiv. Like, this is the shit that's happening right now. I mean, it's really something terrible. I mean, something terrible is already happening, right? But you could see some sort of environmental disaster coming out of this pretty quick. And actually, Thersites, I wanted to ask: is there any questions in the chat that people
want to answer? We do have some super chats if you guys want to hear some of those.
Sure.
But first,
I'm game.
It might be useful to just have everybody give their little summation or final thoughts, maybe a prediction, whatever it might be, sort of your grand takeaway from all that you've seen so far.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Mike, I'll leave Dreeze to talk about Game Over, right? But I guess my takeaway is we're in it for the. I mean, and this is kind of agreeing with what Dreeze has already said and seconded it. We're in it for the long haul here. There is no easy way for any side to end this war. Get ready for mass refugees. Get ready for lots of people to die. And the consequences for Russia, I think, down the line, from this, regardless of how they do in this war, are going to be disastrous. When this is bad. We're going to be talking about this. This is not something that we're going to forget about in 2 weeks. We're going to be talking about this for years to come, and rightfully so. And hopefully they come to the negotiating. Hopefully Russia realizes they fucked up badly, and they come to the negotiating table, and they just take the prestige hit, and so less people have to die. That's all I gotta say.
This whole thing reminded me of the early days of the pandemic, where you were like, holy fucking shit, this actually happened. you were I was reading the news, doom scrolling through the news and through Twitter, kind of delving down to this this existential doom rabbit hole, just kind of spiraling, at least on the first day. And then the next day I woke up. This would have been, I think, Thursday or Friday. I woke up and I was like, oh shit, it's still there. It's still an issue. It's not going to go away. This is only going to get bigger and bigger and worse and worse. And I think Mike's dead on. Like, this is good. This is a huge thing. This is going to last for years. We're going to see refugees, the social political order of Europe is changing right now. We're going to see probably Sweden and Finland try to get into NATO as quickly as possible. I think who knows what's going to happen, and I think that's the scariest part of all of this, is what is going to happen, because there is a full-on war going on in Europe right now, between two large sovereign countries. And we saw fighting in Bosnia, in the former Yugoslavia, at the end of the Cold War in the 90s, and I think people are kind of forgetting that we've seen kind of large-scale combat in Europe before, but I feel like this is on a larger scale than the Balkan Wars, and we're dealing with a country that has nuclear weapons. And I think there is a really kind of, a threat of escalation. Like NATO as a bloc is not sending troops in. NATO countries are sending weapons into Ukraine, and Putin has made the statement that outside countries interfering with Ukraine will see retaliation, the likes of which they've never seen before, which is a poorly veiled threat of nuclear weapons. And there's the question, is Putin above using tactical nukes in Ukraine? I don't think he is. I think there has been some speculation. There have been news reports in Russia of I think unfounded. I think they're totally fabricated, but threats of a possible quote unquote Ukrainian-made dirty bomb, that the Ukrainians, in order to hit back the Russians, the Russian media is reporting that there might be a dirty bomb, a bomb with radioactive material and parts or dust in it, detonated in a city or a crowd. And that's some pretty crazy shit for Russian media to be talking about, and that might be the first stepping stone of a possible public discourse about the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I don't know. A week ago, I would have told you, I don't think Putin's going to invade. And right now, I'm going to tell you, I don't think Putin would. I don't think things would get as bad to the point where they might justify the use of tactical nukes in Ukraine. But who knows? Who knows? This whole thing seems fucked. That's a real illogical decision, but Putin made it, and he's made this decision that we feel is the bad decision, but he's still going full force. He's throwing in tanks, missiles, planes, bombers into Ukraine as we speak, and I think there is a real chance of escalation. I think that I think that's something that we have to watch out for.
Well, that's fucking terrifying.
It is, yeah.
So, I mean, I guess... go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, are there questions we need to answer?
Well, yeah, I was just going to give my, final thought here on this before we get into the Super Chat. So, I guess one question that all this raises is, how did we get to this point? A lot of it is retaining NATO after the organization it was set up to combat disappeared. So not only did the Warsaw Pact, the buffer states of the Soviet Union, go away, but the Soviet Union itself went away, yet NATO persisted. And that was part of how Putin built up his support base in the first place, is playing this game of we are embattled, we're surrounded, we're besieged. And the existence and spread of NATO did, in fact, empower him in that way. But now we're in a situation where, because he actually has become aggressive, now we actually need NATO. So NATO created a problem that it's now solving in many ways, or that it could potentially solve. So it's a really fucked up situation in that way. The other big takeaway is that if we look at Russia's options right now, because Putin invading really fucked him in terms of his diplomatic options, his trade options, I predict that he will have to turn to China. They will be willing to help him because they don't want to lose Russian oil, that would be disastrous, and Russian resources as well, that could have a bad effect on the global economy, would hurt China as well as everybody else. But China's price for that will basically be that Russia becomes a proxy state of China in the long run. And that's assuming that Putin, of course, is able to ride the storm, because it looks like this is not a very popular move on his part. It's not being well received. And up to this point, a lot of his popularity seems to be based on the idea that he's competent. And this doesn't look very competent up to this point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I did just want to jump in on the NATO section. I'm a little bit more understanding of the West to expand NATO to where they did after the fall of the Soviet Union, because these were countries that had just gotten out of the Soviet Union, and, you know, the chance of Russian aggression to retake them over, like...
Yeah, it was there.
It was there, and, you know, and they were very pro-Western, and very pro-American, and, I don't know, it was kind of a logical decision at the time. Like, and I see how that also, like, boosts up Putin at the time, but yeah, I mean, I think with the economic situation of the Russia in the 90s, you were always going to have some form of Russian nationalism.
Yeah, I think another huge mistake back when the Soviet Union broke up is that we were largely friendly toward the other powers from the Eastern Bloc in terms of financial aid and everything,
Yeah.
whereas we told Russia to kick rocks.
Yeah, I mean, the shock therapy thing is a much larger sort of issue.
Yeah, I mean, part of how Russia got to the situation it was in with Yeltsin and then Putin is precisely because America did not offer a friendly hand to a former rival, whereas they did so with Poland and many other countries that had also been in the Eastern Bloc. So Russia, that's how they got to that point where they felt isolated and like they were being demonized, because in many ways they were. I mean, they were being effectively blamed for the entire Cold War, when in reality the origins of the Cold War are fairly complex. I mean, sure, Stalin had a heavy hand in it, but it's not as if, you know, like the Americans and British were completely innocent either when it comes to starting and perpetuating the Cold War. So,
Right.
yeah, anyway, but at this point, though, because I know a lot of people have tried to say, well, Putin's in a tough spot, yada yada, so his invasion is justified. No, it isn't.
Yeah.
I'll agree
Yeah.
with you insofar as he's in a tough spot, but that does not justify invading another country in the way that he has. Or if he is trying to help the Donbass, this does not in any way justify launching a major assault on Kiev, which is hundreds of miles removed from the region they're trying to liberate, supposedly. So that just doesn't fly. Doesn't cut mustard.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are my main thoughts on this. And then also just to echo Michael's point that this will be long and there will be a lot of loss of life. And yeah, if you follow what's happening, it's probably going to be pretty gut-wrenching. It's probably going to get worse, too, as ill-feeling really sets in. As things get more and more desperate, the atrocities will increase.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I guess you guys want to look at a few of these super chats?
Sure, yeah.
All right, we'll start off with the ones at the beginning, and of course, YouTube being YouTube. Wait, no, actually they do show up this time for a change. That's interesting. But I wrote them down anyway because YouTube typically doesn't save stuff for me. Actually, I only saved the last 3, so this doesn't help that much. But yeah, so before that, though, the last several streams in a row, YouTube saved 0 super chats. So I now have to write all of them down by hand. First super chat of the evening came to us from Nicholas for $5 Canadian. Thank you, Nicholas. He said, "I'm poor these days, buddy. Can't donate for a while. Use your platform to convince Joe Rogan to debate Elagabalus. Shoutouts to Ukraine. God bless." Well, thank you, Nicholas. He's our resident expert / high priest of Elagabalus. Sure many of you are familiar with him by now.
Who is Elagabalus?
He was a Roman emperor who was famous for literally spending most of his time engaged in orgies to a sun god that he believed in.
Oh, I think I asked the same question the last time I was on.
Yeah. So,
right.
Elagabalus was in many ways the most unique of all the Roman emperors, and that old stereotype of the Romans, Rome being basically just one endless orgy, that was Elagabalus. I don't think it applies to any other emperor, but it was Elagabalus.
Wow. There you go.
And then we also
He knew how to live.
Yeah, he knew how to do something, right? And I mean, but if you think about it from his perspective, if sexual activity was pleasing to the god Elagabalus and the god gave his blessings to the Roman Empire, then engaging in orgies was helping everyone in Rome. That was his job as emperor, was to make people's lives better. If the gods control your well-being, you got to please them. If you accept the circular logic, it totally makes sense.
There you go.
But anyway, Oscar Palacios for $5. Thank you, Oscar. He says, do you believe that nationalism is transforming to a type of unionism? Example, United Slavic Nation, United China, United Anglo-Union, and etc. If anything, I'd say this war looks very much like the opposite of that, because Ukraine and Russia are pretty closely related. I saw a stat that 1 in 3 Ukrainians speaks Russian as a native language, and 1 in 6 is either ethnically Russian or part Russian. And clearly there's not a lot of goodwill and harmony at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. And it shows political ideologies matter, right? Because despite how culturally and linguistically close these two countries are, you feed a Russian elite a bunch of Russian chauvinism for many years, and this is what they conclude. They conclude all the Ukrainians are Nazis and need to be taken over to protect the Russians, right? And all the linguistic and cultural affinities between the two peoples are thrown out the window. So yeah, I agree with that.
Right.
I agree as well. I don't see nationalism becoming this new kind of unionism. At least not in the post-Soviet and European world.
And even in the Far East, I mean, China, if it were to say take over Korea or Vietnam, that would not go very smoothly because those cultures do not see themselves as part of a greater China. And actually, even though historically we know that the Chinese influence was key to their development, they all have nationalist historiographies which basically try to refute that in any way possible.
I mean, I'll even go further and say there's been the construction of a Taiwanese national identity, despite the fact in Taiwan they speak both Mandarin and Cantonese, same languages as in China. And I guarantee you, if China takes over Taiwan, you will get guerrilla resistance to China based off political identity.
Yeah, and I think Taiwan was first conquered by the Chinese in the Han period. So I mean, we're talking about 2,000 years of shared history.
Oh no. So the first Chinese settlers showed up in Taiwan in the 15 and 1600s, actually.
I think there were already Chinese people there, though. I don't know if they were.
No. They were settlers, actually. They're indigenous Taiwanese people.
There's another island that they controlled. It might not be Taiwan.
It might have been Hainan or something. Anyway, sorry, we're going down a rabbit hole down.
Anyway, but thanks for the question nonetheless. Next up, we have a super chat from Zenobia Palmyra, which is both a great username, and the person also had a really cool avatar for that. $10. Thank you, Zenobia. It should be noted that Putin is a self-admitted passionarist as of a year ago, i.e. he is a Eurasianist of the Gumilyov genetic energy variety. The thing about COVID isolation is good context. Now, I gotta be honest, I'm not sure what a passionarist is, so I'm hoping you guys know.
I'm not sure. Dreeze?
I have no idea. That sounds like some kind of new age stuff, which I don't know anything about.
Huh.
Yeah, in terms of being a Eurasianist, does anybody know? Is there a Gumilyov school of thought or anything like that you guys are familiar with, or?
I'm not. I know Eurasianism can mean a lot of things, and whatever that certain politician wants at the time. I think I don't know. This could be akin to Putin wanting to establish a level of dominance and order over the old Soviet Union, which he is definitely trying to do. He's made the dictators in Belarus and Kazakhstan kind of bend the knee. especially with the recent uprisings in both places during the pandemic, and Russia moving in to support the local leaders and stomp down any opposition. And so I think Putin's. I think Putin definitely wants to rule over the old Soviet Union without the communist ideology, and I think his invasion of Ukraine is a kind of a blatant example of that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for the super chat. I'm sorry we don't really know exactly what you're talking about, but I have to look into passionarism.
Yeah, I'll check it out when I get back home.
All right. Next up, we have History Repeat for $4.99. Also, this person had a cool avatar. I assume they must have a channel or something based on the avatar. How much influence do you think China has on the situation? I mean that in the sense, how has China's current rise and posture influenced Putin's decision?
There was a...
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
So there was an article in The Atlantic a couple of months back where it might have been Anne Applebaum, the author, where she basically, or the author of this article.
Shit. I think his mic might have cut.
Oh no.
I think kind of to support each other as long as they do not meddle too much in each other's domestic politics, so that we see we saw a little bit of that, I think, with the kind of the attempted revolution in Kazakhstan earlier this year, where you saw people rising up, Putin kind of coming in. He sent a couple thousand Russian soldiers, and they actually, if I recall correctly, left a few days after they arrived, after Tokayev, the president there, kind of regained control over society. But I think I think a real scary thing about kind of the rise of authoritarian governments in a lot of places is that they're ready and willing to offer support to each other so that they stay in power, as long as they don't affect each other's domestic politics. And I think that that's kind of been the nature of China's relationship with Russia for a bit. They don't want to get too involved in Russian internal politics, as long as Russia keeps the oil supply going, and that they don't say too much about Chinese domestic politics. So I think China's in an interesting spot. China is big on sovereignty. It's big on, I can do whatever the hell I want in my own borders, and you don't have a right to tell me what I can do. And here we have Russia, a fellow authoritarian country, kind of going directly against that, kind of throwing that whole idea out the window. And I think we saw Chinese discomfort with China has, I think, officially said it is advocating for negotiations and for a de-escalation of the fighting officially. And at the UN Security Council a number of days ago, there was a vote to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and of course Russia vetoed it. It didn't want it to pass, but China abstained from it. It did not support Russia. So I think China's kind of occupying an interesting place here. They want to invade and annex Taiwan, and Gibran and I have actually had various discussions about the feasibility of if that'll actually happen in the near future. But openly invading a foreign country like this, I don't think China's into that at all. And I think it can only serve to cause more crisis on the world stage, crisis in the economy, crisis with a country that China deals with for a lot of energy and shares a super long border with, or a longish border with. So I don't think the Chinese are into it at all.
Yeah. All right. Usually I guess they are against interventions which are wars which cause economic disruption. And apparently Russia does export more things than just oil. I think I've heard also they export nickel and some other pretty important natural resources for the global economy. So having Russia cut off with sanctions is definitely not in China's best interest. But anyway, next up we have another super chat from Oscar Palacios for $5. Thank you, Oscar. He says, I'm kind of pro-Russian because if it was the USA and if New England separated from the US, I would do whatever is possible to regain it.
But this isn't New England, is what I'll say. And actually, and I think the origins of sort of Ukraine as an idea and Ukraine as a nation is pretty important here, right? So, like, Ukrainian nationalism comes about in the 19th century, and Ukrainians start to think of themselves as a separate people around the 19th century, and they start developing a national identity. And Ukrainians in general have been through, in the maelstrom that was the 20th century, some, unifying historical events, right? Like Stalin starving millions of Ukrainians to death in the Soviet Union, and wars in the early 1900s. And it's just a little bit different. It's a different place, and not only that, it's a sovereign state that has been internationally recognized since 1991 and by Russia. And in 1994, Ukraine gave up their existing nuclear stockpile to have their territory be recognized by Russia and never to be violated. So
should have
I
held
think
on to those nukes.
Yeah, right. So like I think it's really important to note that there are not only very important sort of international law here that's being violated, but the Ukrainian identity and the Ukrainian nation has existed for hundreds of years now. And as much as Russia wants to treat Ukraine as like this, proto-Russian little brother, like, that's just not the case. So it's just different from the scenario that would be pointed out there. So that's what I'd say about it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think the comparison to New England ignores a lot of the specificity and like actual differences and historical realities. Like Ukraine and Ukrainians, they're a different culture, they're a different language. It's like, yeah, you can make the argument there's like a regional New England culture and, regional dialects of English, but, Ukraine's a fundamentally different country, fundamentally different culture. And like Mike said, it's been recognized throughout the world by, I assume, every sovereign country that it exists as an independent country, and that Russia agreed that it should exist as an independent country, and that was the basis of them giving up their nukes.
Yeah. And I guess, aside from the American Civil War, there haven't been any instances of, the U.S. having major secession crises where whole sections have tried to break away after, say, the fall of a federal government. Also the federal government's never fallen, but so we never had that scenario take place. But if New England were to break away and then declare itself independent, do so peacefully, then you'd have to wait 30 years and try to reclaim it. That would be the analogous situation. But yeah, it's hard to, I can't really imagine that happening. I know there are alternative history scenarios where the U.S. broke into several pieces, but it's difficult to imagine as things stand right now.
To be blunt, it would be more like if the Navajo Nation broke away from the United States, got international recognition, became an independent country for 30 to 40 years, and then we reinvaded the Navajo Nation and subjected them. Which would be international crime. That's what it would be in that scenario, right?
Yeah, it would have, because you have to have that long pause to allow the country to set up its own government, to really play up what's unique about it, and then basically after 30 years, after a whole generation of people have grown up as a part of this new nation, then telling them your nation is not legitimate, and we're going to end it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So next up, thank you, Oscar. We have a super chat from Zan Looney, $5 Australian. Thank you, Zan. He says, do you think Putin got a bad diagnosis and realizes how little time he has left? The Russian generals did not look happy in the news report I saw. So basically he's asking, is Putin on his last leg and trying to secure his legacy through a successful invasion of Ukraine?
Yikes.
What I will say is, I think Putin, regardless, I don't know about Putin's health, I think he knows he's at the later stages of his presidency and his ruling of the country. And I think he is concerned about legacy. I think that's, I really do think that's part of it. Add in some paranoia in there, you know, and you might get what you get. I don't know. That's my take.
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead, Dreeze.
I don't know that much about Putin's health. I will say, like, I think he's starting to look really old now these days. Like, he is.
Yeah.
One of the other professors on campus pointed this out. Like, his face is starting to look pretty puffy. I think age is finally catching up with him, but he's definitely in the second half of his rule over Russia, and you know, I have no idea if you know, he had a terminal illness, would he plunge the whole country into chaos? I kind of doubt it.
Yeah.
But I definitely think he's concerned about his legacy, and I think he's fucking it up royally right now.
Yeah, and I mean, it's worth noting too that, I mean, there are some of those sort of like landmark birthdays where, you know, age starts to show. It doesn't necessarily denote ill health.
Mm-hmm.
It could, but it doesn't necessarily. So, I mean, yeah, he's about to hit 70 soon, so that's, you know, he is an old man at this point. I mean, it's hard to spin it any other way. So
getting old sucks.
It's done a show. You know, there's no fighting Father Time forever. So, next up we have a super chat from Richard Leston that was for $1.99. It was just a meme. Thank you, Richard. Next up we have a super chat for $9.99 from John Slaughter, which sounds like Sergeant Slaughter's brother. He says, Putin may not have invaded if Trump was president. It's not that he was a good president, but his off-the-wall antics and unpredictability might have been too much of a risk for Putin.
I'm going to say almost the exact opposite. I think Putin might have been more likely to invade if Trump, at this moment, if Trump was president, because he knew he would have a stooge in the White House to try to not rally Europe to do anything about it.
Well, the other complication would be that if the whole media was saying that letting Ukraine get invaded was a sign of weakness on the part of the U.S., Trump might have been under pressure to try to prevent the invasion from happening. A similar pressure to what Biden has faced, similar critique.
I don't know. I think that's too complicated by half, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it changes the calculus, but maybe there's a scenario where Putin thinks he could accomplish his political goals without invading because Trump would be so not as anti-Russian that he might be able to get stuff by just threatening. I mean, the irony is not lost on me that, like, remember the price of Trump going to Zelensky and saying that trying to manufacture a scandal against Hunter Biden? It's Javelin missiles, right?
Yeah.
Which the Ukrainians desperately need right now to fight off against Russian tanks. Like,
yeah, I mean, just based on some of the weird shit Trump said out of office during this crisis, I can only imagine what he would have said as president during all this.
I was going to say, like, I think Putin was you know, I'm not sure, again, I'm not sure what logic Putin was following with this invasion, but I think that he was really banking on kind of this drift away from NATO's larger cohesion, or the cohesion of NATO that we saw under Trump. You know, Trump was like, you know, Trump raised, you know, public doubts about NATO. He was like, oh, we should make these other countries pay more, and if they don't, well, you know, who knows about NATO? And I think Putin saw this and was like, haha, you know, the cracks are beginning to form. And right. If, you know, Trump was president right now, like, you know, who the fuck knows what it would look like? I think he would personally be like, hell yeah, I think it's great that Putin's invading. And I think he'd be fighting, you know, a larger. He'd be I think it would have been a death knell for NATO. Let me rephrase that. If Trump was president right now, I think NATO would be fucked. NATO, we would see kind of the beginning of the disintegration of NATO, because I think Trump would have been okay with Putin invading Ukraine, and I think that would have caused a huge issue with the cohesiveness and collective security nature of NATO.
this is a question I ask myself. Without a very pro-NATO president in the White House right now, does Germany fold and not and continue to allow Nord Stream 2 to be built and not agree to SWIFT sanctions? I think there's a possibility. And, sometimes I think we in the United States get a little bit too American focused. Like, I think the SPD coming into power in Germany over the past year, and SPD being historically a more pro-Russian party, was also a big part in this calculus, right? And the fact they're not behaving in the way that many observers thought they would, and that the Russians probably thought they would, was a big miscalculation on the Russians' part.
Agreed.
All right. Next up, we have... Let's see. Levant for $5. Thank you, Levant. He says, congrats on a great stream, especially for a Saturday night. Over 500 on here. Shame there had to be a war for it, though. I agree. I'm surprised that, my stream on taking out the trash, or one of my other streams on, whatever we talked about, military blunders part 2, Stalin part 3. I'm surprised those weren't the ones to get over 500, But, alright, you gotta take it where you can get it, I guess. Alright, thanks, Levant. Next up is Ken Cook for $4.99. Thank you, sir. Any chance the Russian troops being sent in are the B team? Their equipment looks a bit dated for a modern military to be using. Cheers, guys.
Yes, it is.
Oh, go ahead.
I've seen some news reports on Twitter and some other things where they're commenting. It's like, hey, these people are using older equipment. Like, they're using some of the old, T-72s, not using T-90s or some of the newer stuff. And the reason is a lot of those troops have been pulled from the Far Eastern military units, out, in your Vladivostok, or, all as far east in Russia as you can get. And the Far Eastern military district has been long on the low, or I believe, if from what I've read is accurate, that the Far East has been low on the priority of modernization and having the best equipment. And so Putin was pulling from a lot of reinforcements from the Far East to bring them to Western Russia, and so they have older stuff that isn't as good as one would expect it to be.
Huh, that's fascinating. I'm chuckling because and I don't know if there's some Futurama fans here in the in the chat. Does Putin and the Russian military brass go to the Zach Brannigan school of military strategy? Throw in the cannon fodder first, and then have the professionals come in and mop up the resistance.
Yeah, sort of like the video game logic where you send your weakest thugs first to soften them up, and then you save your elite units for the end. I mean, I don't know. It does seem odd. I mean, I guess it's possible that because of Russia's economic problems since independence, it could be that while they do have certain advanced weapons, that they never built enough of them to equip all their forces. So a lot of their guys are still using leftover Soviet stuff.
What I will say is, I doubt Russia's paratroopers are like the poorly trained force of the Russian army. But there, as we previously were mentioning, there have been 2 paratroop drops in Ukraine, and both those forces got wiped out. So I think the better explanation is the Ukrainian army was better drilled and better trained than many observers thought.
That could be part of it. Another thing to remember is that when you're looking at military efficiency, sheer numbers aren't just all there is. You also have to keep in mind training, which costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
Especially keeping up training, and also maintenance of equipment. Because actually, if you look at the cost the U.S. Air Force spends, at a certain point, as ridiculously expensive as the F-22 was, there would be a time when it would be more expensive to keep the F-15s in service due to mounting maintenance costs on an old airframe than it would be to just build F-22s. So, I mean, that's always something to keep in mind. Maintenance is very expensive on tanks, aircraft, and especially combat equipment, but also even trucks that haul things, that haul fuel. I mean, the Army has to replace its heavy trucks about every 20 years because the transmissions go bad. And I mean, that's a 20-year replacement with constant maintenance along the way. So that's something to keep in mind when we're looking at some of the random stuff we're seeing the Russians roll out, is that they might have just had to go to the depot and say, okay, what's running?
Right.
So, all right. Next up, we have one that Dreeze touched on a little bit earlier, but I guess we can expand upon a bit more. It comes to us from Anthony LaRocco for $4.99. Thank you, Anthony. He says, how similar is the invasion to the Winter War of 1939 to 40?
My take on it is, there might be some same political strategies, but militarily quite different, right? The terrain's very different. Eastern Finland is full of lakes and forests. It was in the dead of winter. This is on plains, and it's partially why military observers were predicting the Russian tank columns to take all of eastern Ukraine very quickly within a few days, because the terrain is very favorable towards tank combat, but it didn't happen. So I don't know. I think there's some key differences here. It's also not occurring in the context of a global world war, right? And that definitely changes the international context. So that's
we know of.
Yeah, maybe this is the start of a global world war. Hopefully not. We'll see, I guess.
But I think, I don't know. I definitely agree with you, Mike. But I think there are some maybe some broader similarities than saying, and I say that knowing more about like kind of the Soviet state of military affairs in '39 than I do, the specifics of the Russian state of affairs in 2022, because I felt like it definitely seems like in the Winter War, I think like the Russians expected to just kind of bust in, steamroll through the Ukrainians, and have this over in a couple of days, be in Kiev and control the central Ukraine or eastern Ukraine within a few days. And I think the Soviets in '39, they made the questionable decision to attack in winter, but I think they expected to kind of steamroll through the various defensive lines and end up in Helsinki in a couple of weeks, and kind of just swat Mannerheim away. So I think to some extent there might be like a similar way of thinking, a similar feeling that the Russian or the Soviet military was stronger and more capable than it actually was. Kind of adding to the logic and calculus of all this.
Yeah. All right. Next up, we have a super chat from Tom DeRosa. Thank you, Tom. $5. He says, do you think that the bad performance of the Russian army is due to the conscripts being poorly motivated in offensive wars?
Yes.
That's definitely a thought that I've been exploring most of the day. Even before Michael got here, I was talking about that with Tina earlier. Yeah, I don't think that the Russian conscripts are all that motivated to do this.
Agreed, and I would imagine they're probably not that well trained either.
Yeah, because from what little I understand of the Russian army, they spend a lot more time on their Spetsnaz or whatever they're called now, and then their paratroopers in certain formations, and then the conscripts are just kind of there.
Yeah, and I heard two interesting stories on Russian conscripts. The first was among the Russians that have been taken prisoner, many of them told the Ukrainians that they expected to be treated as liberators, and that's what their commanders told them. So they're poorly informed. Second, that part of the reason why these Russian tank offensive haven't been effective is because the Ukrainian conscripts the Russian conscripts refused to get out of their vehicles and provide an infantry screen to prevent anti-tank weapons from being used against tank columns. And so that gets at the training aspect of it. So those are just two reports I've heard.
Yeah, I've seen those as well, and that kind of reeks of like uninformed, poorly trained, unmotivated conscripts, and it's well. There was a scene, I think somewhere in the East, where this old woman goes up to this Russian soldier who's standing there, and she gives him a bunch of sunflower seeds, and she's like, put these in your pocket so that when you get killed, at least when you die and fall on the ground, the seeds will scatter and they'll eventually be sunflowers where you die. And that's that's coming from like an old babushka, and it's like I don't think the Russian soldiers were expecting this level of hatred and kind of just visceral, despising of them that they're receiving from Ukrainians.
Right.
Yep. All right. Next up, we have a super chat from Iverson Silva de Jesus for $10.90 and a currency designated by R. I'm not really sure what that is.
Oh,
but,
I think that's might be Brazilian.
Okay.
Reals, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe that would make sense because the real has enough value. Because I know the minimum super chat is $2 USD. I'm pretty sure.
Interesting.
So I knew that couldn't be ruble.
No, it's not rubles.
But anyway, thank you, Silva de Jesus. He wants to know, what if Russia decides to go nuclear to restart it all? Well, I think that's not a long conversation. We're all fucked.
Game over, man. As Dreeze put in his
over.
meme, game over. Pray to God they don't do that. That's all I gotta say.
No, I think if we see nuclear weapons used by Russia in Ukraine, NATO is going in, and if NATO goes in, because like they have to respond. They cannot tolerate the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and there will be a massive escalation that will almost certainly result in a larger nuclear exchange, and we'd all be fucked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Next up, we have 3 in a row from Chris Cole for $1.99. So I guess maybe that's the minimum. I don't know. But thank you anyway, Chris. He wants to know, first of all, the global order is over. Y'all don't get it yet. Well, I mean, I guess if he's talking about maybe the global order of the UN and NATO preventing invasions, I mean, I guess it's never quite been fully effective at that. But I guess in Europe that's been the case since the fall of the Soviet Union. I don't know if that necessarily brings down the world order, though, because so far it looks like most of the damage is accruing, obviously, to Ukraine for being invaded and to Russia in terms of international standing.
I didn't think in our conversation we were downplaying this. We were saying it's a big deal, and Dreeze let in with game overs and game over international order. So I think we agree with you, man. It's pretty bad.
And to the last question, if nukes become involved, you better make your peace with the world or with God.
Yeah, something. I mean, because that is game over, man.
Yeah, that is. I'm curious what his next 2 ones were.
Yeah, so after that, he says another one in 199. Thank you, Chris. He says, NATO will be gone. The U.S. has no interest in Europe.
Maybe if Trump was president.
Right?
I mean, even though Trump was definitely not pro-NATO, I don't think it's fair to say that the U.S. has no interest in Europe, given all of our trading links, economic links, cultural links. So
I wanted to mention this. I was talking with Derek earlier about this. So the Major League Soccer season just started. The Columbus Crew were playing here. I saw no less than 6 Ukrainian flags at that soccer game. People fucking care. Honestly.
Yeah, I mean, because Americans in general don't tend to care too much about other countries, but Europe is, the countries of Europe are an exception to that.
And this is breaking through in a way that the 2014 invasion didn't. People didn't really care about the 2014 invasion, but people care about this. And I don't know, I just don't. Americans are always going to care to some degree what happens in Europe, despite our isolationist tendencies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Europe, if it were a, say, random country in Africa or South America, then Americans probably would be pretty dismissive as a whole.
Yeah.
But
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
So sorry to interrupt. I think there was a coup, and was it Guinea-Bissau, maybe a few weeks ago, where like a military general overthrew the president, and no one cared because it's a tiny country in Africa.
Yeah, and also the other thing that makes Ukraine relevant to Americans is that it involves the great nemesis, Russia. Because we've had what was it, the wall-to-wall coverage of Russia for several years by Rachel Maddow, and that's in addition to the Cold War era where the older generation was raised on decades of fear Russia propaganda. So, I mean, yeah, anything Russia does is going to bring a lot of attention.
Don't be dissing the old nemesis too much. That's the reason Mike and I got Flasivores at OSU.
That's true. And the fact that the Greeks have not managed to make themselves a menace to many of their neighbors has meant that it's been harder for me to get such things.
Right. And
Derek, if the Greek communists had won the Civil War, maybe.
Yeah, I mean that's true. Like if they had won the Civil War, was that in the late '60s? They were defeated by the colonels. I mean, if the communists had won and then joined the Soviet bloc, then maybe it would have changed everything.
Right. And lastly, I mean, I guess regardless of what I originally talked about the people, but regardless of what the people think, it almost doesn't matter. The military-industrial complex and the people in the military care about Europe. And until that changes, our policy is not going to change.
Yeah, and also you have to remember two things that make countries relevant aside from just good feeling or cultural connections: money and resources.
Yep.
And Europe doesn't have all that many resources, but they have quite a bit of money.
Yep. So
that means it's very hard to cut them off in that way. And then the final one from Chris Cole for 199. Thank you, Chris. He said, and quotes, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun," as kind of like a reminder, which, I mean, ultimately, I guess that's correct. I mean,
well, we'll see how effective sanctions are, is what I'll say in response to that. Because I don't know. I mean, we'll see whether this sort of pure military power of Russia or significant financial sanctions from the U.S. and Europe, which is more effective over time. We're going to get a crash course.
I definitely think sanctions will take a while, but they're looking pretty. I think when the Russian stock market turns on Monday, it's going to be an unpretty picture. Although who knows if it is? I can see Putin being like, "No, keep those computers off."
Right.
Yeah. Next up, we have Oscar Palacios from earlier, $5. Wanted to follow up. He said, "I disagree that Ukrainian is a different identity than Russian. I can't read my own writing. I'm sorry. You knew it as our New England. It's more analogous to New England because they are our origin story. But we must agree to disagree."
Well,
it's. Okay. I'm sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
I mean, this is going to be a harsh response. I appreciate this dialogue with you. What I will say is, 40 million Ukrainians also disagree, and that just matters. So anyway, sorry. Go ahead, Dreeze.
I mean, he's right that Kievan Rus is kind of the origin point for Ukrainian and Russian culture, and Kievan Rus ceased to exist a billion years ago, and a lot has changed and developed since then. The kind of unifying, or the kind of the larger Slavic culture that emerged from Kievan Rus has branched off into different things, and to say that it's analogous because New England is the origins of the United States, I mean, it ignores hundreds of years of history. It ignores separate cultures. It ignores separate languages. I mean, it's a selective reading of the past to fit certain beliefs and ideas.
Well, and lastly, there's a bit of an irony here, right? If Putin wanted to, and Russia in general wanted to dissuade Ukrainians from embracing Ukrainian identity, invading them was like the last thing they should do, right? like peaceful interchange and not a trying to force them by will into Russia, might have worked a lot better for Ukrainians to give up a Ukrainian identity. A prosperous Russia and a free Russian passports would have done that, right? But they went the opposite approach. And so now what you're going to see is generations of people think being Ukrainian is important. And why is it important? Because their father, their mother their brother, their sister fought and died in a war with Russia. And, that's what creates political identities.
Yeah. All right. Now we have one that's a bit more of a source question. It comes to us from Samir Tabika, $4.99. Thank you, Samir. And he asked, what are your sources for the 2 Russian parachute attacks were destroyed? I haven't seen anything like that. And also, how can we compare this with Finland when it has just started?
Yeah, so really quick on the sources. I got that from the Kyiv Independent. So you can check on their website. They have a very long breakdown, especially on the Valskiv parachute drop and what happened there. Now, again, take it with a grain of salt. These sources are from mainly the Ukrainian military defense, but it doesn't appear that those airfields were held, and it was reported and verified by the New York Times. So, but yeah, I would recommend to check that out. It's a pretty good source for what I've seen. The Finland comparison I'll leave to Dreeze.
So what was his objection that we're just on day 3 or 4 of this war?
Yeah.
I mean, if anything, I imagine Russia's done better in Ukraine so far than they did in Finland, because the first few days in Finland, I mean, they couldn't even get their troops fully deployed because Voroshilov fucked up the initial deployment so bad that they couldn't even deploy half their units at once.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think there's probably the legitimate objections to comparing what's going on right now to the Winter War, but, we're just kind of here talking. That's all I have.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison invites itself. I mean, obviously, it's not completely analogous. And also, Russia isn't using this as a tune-up for a clash with a Central European megapower.
Right.
So, yeah, the stakes are totally different. And also, there was no sense in Stalin's time that the USSR was in decline or had to pull itself out of a tailspin. I mean, at that time, it was on the rise, and
Right.
it thought it had gotten further than it had.
Right.
So Russia's in a completely different spot vis-a-vis where the Soviets were. I mean, all kinds of things are completely different, but at the same time, this is an attempt to expand outside of their borders against a neighbor they underestimated, and in an optional war, because neither war was necessary. So
where I do want to say, it's worth mentioning, this is day 3. Like, things can change very radically.
Yeah,
We're working on limited information. Kyiv could fall in 12 hours, and the entire state of the Ukrainian army could be different in 2 or 3 days. So, and scarily enough, Dreeze's scenarios of, a possible nuclear exchange, right, are on the table, which is very frightening. So, yeah, it is important for us to remind each other that we don't know what's going to happen, and we're living in very uncertain times with this.
yeah, I mean, even though it is clear that a lot of Ukrainians are fighting hard, I guess we don't really have a clear picture of, by percentage of the population, how many of them are out there battling it out. So it's possible that there is a small number of dedicated people, and once some of them are dead, then that's it. So we don't really even have a feel for that as of yet. So we're just basing it on, again, the title of the stream, the Russo-Ukrainian War so far.
Indeed.
So, and then next up we have another one from Oscar Palacios. He says, prediction: Russia will conquer all of the eastern side of the rest of Ukraine, and then the rest of Ukraine will become a puppet state. The war will last 6 to 12 months. What's Poland's role?
I mean, we'll see about that prediction. I mean, there's certainly a scenario where I feel like Russia takes over the eastern half of Ukraine, but even if that happens, the chances of Western Ukraine going along with it and being a part of that puppet state, unless there's...
hell no.
I mean, I just don't think it's going to happen. And this gets at Poland's role. You know what Poland's going to be doing over those 6 to 12 months? Smuggling men and material into Western Ukraine on the Ukraine-Polish border, that's where Poland borders Ukraine in Western Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So, like, again, I just want to reiterate, as we were talking about earlier, this is not ending quickly. And I think a scenario of complete capitulation of Ukraine to Russia and integration into some sort of Russian puppet state is pretty far-fetched at this point. I mean, we'll see. But I don't see that happening.
Yeah, if anything, like, the vast majority of like ethnic Russians or people who identify as ethnic Russians live in the eastern part of the country. And that's kind of the whole idea of the legitimacy behind the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. The western part of the country, I mean, you still have a lot of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians, and Ukrainian for many in the western part of the country is that's their first language. So like the I feel like, like a proxy puppet state in the West is nonsense. I think the Russians might try to use the Dnieper as some type of barrier or some type of new forced border. But if they do, I don't think a puppet state on the western part of the country would stand. They would still. I think they would just be out and out resisting. And I think Poland had become the world's largest refugee camp for a while, but Poland would probably be a huge avenue for smuggling weapons and men in, and Poland would do what NATO does, whatever that turns out to be.
Yeah, and I do want to, and I completely agree with all that, and I do think the chance of a puppet state east of the Dnieper is possible. But also the chance of the Western Ukrainian government agreeing to that and stop fighting is, I don't know.
Very low, in my opinion.
Right now, yeah, definitely.
We have another one from Jensen O. James for $2. Thank you, Jensen. And he says, the EU should federate for better security. Discuss.
I think a common defense policy for the EU is, if you mean, does he mean federate as in break up into multiple subsequent sections, or
I assume he means that they should
just form
a united EU military. I don't know what the political ramifications are, but maybe just the military.
I think it's fascinating because the French have been talking about that for a while, and they're kind of pro it. It looked like it was dead for a very long time. Congrats, Russia! You've now perhaps, reignited the idea of a EU with a national defense policy across all European states. Good job, excellent job.
Yup.
I think that's on the table again, which is crazy. That this has been dead for a long time, and they've just revived it. Because also, and this is sort of a thing we haven't discussed here. The chances of Ukraine joining NATO after all of this might be low, but the chances of Ukraine joining the EU, I think, has skyrocketed from this. And so,
I think it's going to happen.
Yeah. So an EU with a common defense policy? Congrats, Russia! You just made a NATO with Ukraine in it. I mean, yeah, I think that's a really good point.
This goes back to kind of our larger thesis. Like nothing good comes of this whole thing. It seems like it's the worst decision of like a really bad decision to make, and it's having it's like the monster from Watchmen. It's unifying the world against Russia.
Yeah, I think that's right. They just predicted Zelensky would run for his life and the country would collapse immediately, and that hasn't happened. And it might still happen, but I don't know how you turn back the time on world opinion uniting against Russia like this. I don't think you can.
All right. Next up, we have Chris Cole for $1.99. Again, thank you, Chris. He says, Enlightenment liberalism is on the ash heap of history.
I don't know what that means, but okay.
Well, I mean, I guess he's saying that Enlightenment liberalism is a dying political model, and it has been disproven or
in some way invalidated by events.
Well, congrats, Chris. You got a war over Enlightenment and liberalism or Putinocracy, and Putinocracy is currently losing. So we'll see what happens.
I mean, this question could go back to our earlier discussion on the refugee crisis. Like, the fact that Poland a month or so ago was like, we can't have our borders open to refugees, and all of a sudden their borders are open to refugees. This could be like, because this is what the EU would want. This is what NATO would want in this situation, and this might get some. Let's say, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, he's not pals with Putin anymore. He's closing ranks with the rest of NATO. This could have some effect in realigning some more right-leaning regimes in Europe. Who knows? So, there might still be that ass shape there, but I'm not totally convinced that Enlightenment liberalism is on it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and if by Enlightenment liberalism he means a sort of democratic peace around the world, yeah, I think that is gone. I mean, I think we are very clearly moving into a decade or two, at least, of rival autocracies and democracies fighting for the hearts and minds around the world, and perhaps sometimes coming to blows. And that's kind of where we're at, which is a scary thought, scary world. But yeah, I mean, yeah, ideological war is back.
Yeah.
Well, let's not be too hasty about the end of the good times, Mike. Our friends in Beijing are still there. There's still chance for the worldwide communist revolution.
Oh God,
the worldwide communist revolution was actually just rampant corporatism at this point.
There you go.
But,
there you go.
There's got to be a couple true believers in China still.
Somewhere. Probably in exile and some desperate outpost in the Gobi.
Is it the Marxist clubs being arrested by the Chinese police because that happened?
All right.
Womp
We got another one from Samir Tabika for $4.99. Thank you, Samir. He said, "There's no chance of a nuclear exchange. Putin is not reckless like that. Think of how slowly he moved on Ukraine. It's been 8 years since his first move."
That is kind of interesting. The fact that why now? Why did he wait so long? Who knows? Maybe he felt like Biden was in a weak position. Maybe he felt like Trump had weakened NATO or the EU to some extent, or I don't know. Maybe there's something going on in Russia itself where it's like, hey, a war is a good way to distract from it, or shore something up.
Right.
Who knows? Who knows?
There were pretty big protests during the pandemic. Some of the biggest over Navalny. And one thing consistent that you've seen with Russia for the past 2 decades is anytime there is turmoil at home, they start a war. They did it in 2008 with the recession. They did it in 2014 after some major protests, and they're doing it again now.
And they did it in 1904.
Right? Yeah, right. In 1904 as well. So I think that's part of it. All I'll say is I really hope you're right. And the only other thing I'll say as well is that anytime Russian troops are near NATO troops, there is a possibility for accidental clashes, and that's a scary thing when you have 2 nuclear powers. But hopefully rational minds prevail, and no one ever considers that option.
All right. Next up, we have the Iverson Silva de Jesus again for a 1090 in Brazilian currency. He said, "An age of empires is starting again. Beware, Taiwan."
Beware, Taiwan is what he said?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I agree. I'd be very concerned about Taiwan right now. We'll see what happens. I hope nothing. It's a lovely place. I've been there. Beautiful country. Really great people. Really kind people. They don't deserve war to come to them. So that's all.
By Taiwan, you mean the real China, the Republic of China, correct?
Yeah, the land of Chiang Kai-shek.
Right.
Yeah, I still can't get over John Cena going on Chinese television to apologize for saying that Taiwan was an independent country.
Oh God.
I mean,
Jesus Christ, I'd forgotten about that. What a
yeah.
crock of shit.
I mean, I can't imagine spending my life as, a tough guy who makes a reputation not only being a pro wrestler, but wrestling through injuries and being one of the tougher wrestlers. And then being like, yeah, I'm going to apologize for stating an established fact about the world.
And I really want to emphasize, like, this actually really pisses me off when certain people from Western countries or more established countries or larger countries take a look at these small countries and say they don't really have a national identity, they're not that important, let's just let a big country take over them. They haven't visited these countries. They don't know what it's like there. I lived in Estonia for 8 months out of my life. And it's an interesting place with its own identity, with its own people and its own culture, and the humanity of people in these smaller countries needs to be recognized and cared about.
Yeah. Also, somebody had a good one. John Cena is Zhong Zina.
Maybe he's a devout Marxist-Leninist. Who knows?
That's impossible. Hey, he's the person keeping Marxist-Leninism alive in the Chinese world.
Yeah, like John Cena's like the Atlas of that cosmos. All right. Next up, we have Samir Tabika for $4.99. Thank you, Samir. Also, the West must be careful with Putin and Russia. You cannot break it. Putin is better, more stable for the West than whatever oligarch that would replace him, like in Iraq.
Yeah, maybe, and that's a scary thought. I mean,
agreed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a roll of the dice.
Russian instability is frightening. Simply because the sheer number of nuclear weapons they have. I'm sorry, Russian instability is frightening as hell. So, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Not to mention the fact that they have nuclear weapons. And, if it breaks up, we don't know where those go.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean,
yes.
Scary as hell.
But yeah, that is true that you don't want Russia to fall apart at a rapid pace. That is not good. I mean, we saw what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed quickly. That had some negative consequences, including the current borders that have been drawn, some nukes that might have gone missing.
If there is a multiverse, there is a universe in which the world was destroyed in a nuclear war after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
I do not want to ever risk that again.
Or where nobody backed down from the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
All right. Next up, we have WB for $5. He says, "Love the guest. Great show." Well, thank you, WB.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Marcos for £5. He says, "White refugees have privilege. Also, Azov and Idar are not even once on TV. Donbass independent and UN soldiers in the midst, like in Kosovo. I solved it."
Okay. So, hold up.
Well, we can all go home right now.
Yeah.
Game over.
Game over. Different game over.
Gentlemen, we have come full circle.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear, though, that even though that was Putin's putative position that Donbass goes independent, well, I mean, the reality is that he wants that land for Russia.
But I mean, this actually gets at... This is interesting because it gets at the... I mean, I know we're joking about it, but it gets at the political goal of Putin, right? If he was serious about just Donbass and Luhansk independent, why the hell is he invading Kyiv?
Yeah, exactly.
He could have sent 150,000 troops to take those two provinces, declared them independent, and declare victory. And no one in the world would have fucking cared.
It could have been that easy. He would have just done the same thing he did in Georgia.
Yeah, sadly, Putin is a lot more ambitious here, and he's paying the price for it.
Yeah, I mean, a pretty thin pretext as far as it goes, especially once you start sending columns deep into Ukraine
well beyond the bounds of the areas you're supposedly trying to save.
I mean, right now he is turning Kyiv into Grozny. That is not someone who has a political goal of only securing Donbass.
Yeah. I think we're getting very close to the end here.
Cool.
Chris Cole for $1.99. He says the West is guilty of many crimes. Yeah, I mean it is. That's true.
Sure.
That's a big fact.
And I mean, yeah, and obviously I know some people have done some whataboutism when it comes to U.S. imperialism versus what Russia's doing right now. Okay, so while, say, the Iraq War was clearly a mistake and clearly harmed a lot of people who had nothing to do with 9/11, we're not talking about the Iraq War.
That's right.
So there's that.
And there's a time to talk about things, right? Say, when the U.S. invaded Iraq and Russia said, this is a war crime, this is a bad thing you're doing, and then we come back and say, well, Russia did bad things too. Who the fuck cares? Right now, Ukraine's being invaded.
Yeah, I mean,
just
I'm
like in
against all
2003,
imperialism, whether it's the U.S. invading Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years, or whether it's what Putin's doing now, what Putin's done in Chechnya. No matter where the imperialism takes place, I am not in favor of it. Or China trying to bully Taiwan, whatever it might be. Somebody earlier mentioned Israel attacking Damascus. Actually, I forgot that one. Sorry, I knew I forgot one. Forgetful Functor won $5. Said Israel bombed Damascus twice in the past week.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm against that too. I'm not in favor of imperialism. But you can't say, well, another country gets a free imperialism because we had one X number of years ago.
Right.
It's not how that works.
Right. And so, I think all I'll say to those is there's a time and place for talking and about imperialism being bad, and I personally have condemned the Yemeni invasion. I think I've condemned Iraq, and and the next imperialist thing we'll condemn. But right now, let's not play a whataboutism with Russia and Ukraine. This is really bad.
Yeah, I mean, whataboutism, and when it comes to imperialism, you could do it all fucking day.
Yeah, and they're all bad.
And they're all bad. None of this is good. When people are murdered by armed columns of men seeking nebulous goals, that's bad no matter whose goals they are or who the people are doing the killing.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And we do have one final one, but there's not a comment. It comes from Richard Chen. $75 NT, which I'm not sure exactly what that is, but
I'm not sure either.
Thank you for the don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that's it for this evening.
Cool.
So thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you, Michael and Dreeze, for coming out as well.
Thanks for
fun.
having us.
Yeah, and so obviously everybody, I'm sure, will stay glued to the news as this continues to develop. None of us know how this will end, so it will be, I'm sure it'll be a surprise to us all in some way. I doubt that things will proceed in an even way. War is pretty unpredictable. So, yeah, I guess we'll all be finding out something in the future.
Yeah.
And also when it comes to which sources were reliable for this war, that will become much, much clearer as time progresses, because eventually the facts on the ground will come to light. And we'll see who was telling the truth and who was bullshitting for clicks.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Anyway, thank you all once again, and I will actually see you guys tomorrow night when I talk about Three Kingdoms China. We'll talk about the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and then we will tier rank some figures from the Han Court and from the Yellow Turban ranks.
It's pretty interesting stuff, so come out, guys, because I think that will be fun.
Yeah, it's something I've been trying to do for a couple years now, and it's just now coming to fruition. So that's why I did not cancel tomorrow night's stream for this. But anyway, so thank you all once again. Thank you, Jonathon, Dreeze. Thank you, Michael. And we are going to go off the air right now. All right, we are off.
Cool.